This story is about the world's first virtual reality RPG. The top of the rankings of this game for a long time has been occupied by the guild King of the End. So far, no one had been able to bypass this guild. However, now 7 days had passed since the disappearance of the team leader, and no one knew what would happen next. One night, the volcano, which had been dormant for many years, suddenly came to life and began spewing thick clouds of smoke and ash into the sky from its deep crater. Suddenly, some unknown monster that could not be compared to any known living creature flew upwards from its bubbling crater. Looking up, the archers standing on the rock ledges prepared their bows, and hearing them shout that the boss was coming and they should prepare a control effect, they began to activate their skills. One of the archers, an archer girl releasing an arrow towards the monster, activated a skill glowing with a bright green light that covered the entire arrow. Her arrow crossed with the same one, only bright purple in color, and flew towards the monster with it. However, these arrows, as if they met a ghost, were unable to hit the monster and did not harm it in the slightest. The players watching from below were horrified by this outcome. They hadn't expected the monster to be so immune to control effects. In the next instant, the monster jumped down towards them, causing a huge explosion and leaving a trail where it landed. The core of the volcano also shook from the force of the explosion, and lava began to erupt from it. The weapons left by the players were still stuck around the rock, swords and spears, which they did not have time to use and lost from the surprise. The monster, meanwhile, seemed to be feeling superior, and so, with slurping sounds, was now slowly approaching the players. The guy who was looking at him, unable to move, silently stared at the monster. He knew that with his injuries, he wouldn't be able to resist it. Laughing at the absurdity of the situation, he said that he hadn't even lost a tenth of his health despite all the attacks he had endured. Then he said that he thought someone was ready to strike the final blow. This guy didn't immediately notice another player approaching him from behind, who also didn't say a word as he walked towards him. However, as soon as this player came closer, he was able to see him, and now he was staring at him in surprise. He didn't say a word, staring at the monster. At this moment, the monster began to scream loudly right before his eyes, losing the health he had full, barely having time to regenerate it. The guy's face lit up with a smile when he heard that. It seemed that everything there was already under his control, and he already knew the outcome of the battle. With a serene look, he slowly drew his sword in its scabbard from the game vault, anticipating an easy prey. The guy's smile grew even wider as he mockingly said, looking grimly at the monster, that there was nothing surprising about defeating a weak opponent. Without wasting any more time on unnecessary conversations, the guy, looking the monster in the eyes, slowly pulled out the sword resting in the scabbard, and then began to quickly unwind it in both hands, preparing to use some sort of technique against the monster. Swiping the sword, the player suddenly threw it quickly with force in the monster's direction, later watching the blade swiftly whiz through the air. The monster stood motionless, looking at him, not expecting such a quick attack in his direction, not immediately realizing how to reflect the sword flying at him with the skill. In the next instant, the guy rushed towards it, quickly inflicting a huge amount of wounds and damage. His sword flashed through the air, cleaving the monster's flesh and scales. Blood and sparks flew from each blow, and moans of pain and rage filled the space. Flying past him towards the rock behind him, the player quickly pushed off of it, immediately turning back around in flight and rushing in the other direction. The monster, unhappy that he had dared to be wounded, began to quickly gather energy, directing it towards the guy, hoping to fight back. The one in turn cut off its paw, and again, without saying a word, quickly inflicted several wounds on the monster's torso, this time finishing it off and preventing it from healing. The player looked at him, who was sitting there without strength, his jaw dropped. He couldn't believe his eyes and what had happened in a matter of minutes, so he couldn't utter a word in shock. This player remembered trying to take down this boss himself with skills that produced a set of effects, but he couldn't. And this guy had taken him down so easily. Apparently not for nothing. After all his exploits, he was categorized as the first and the top players of this game all over the planet. The girl sitting in front of the Aaron with the recording had her hand to her head and was staring intently and intensely at the screen where the battle was being recorded. Nervously biting her fingernails, the guildmaster of the last guild, Choi Yu-chun, didn't stop staring at the screen until the recording ended. Looking at the views below the entry, she noticed that this entry was more popular than she originally thought. This footage of a monster raid in the open world had blown up the net in just a week. 7 million views spoke for itself. Next, after the video ended, a video popped up, with the preview asking what the likelihood was that the missing power user would return. Not thinking long, the girl silently clicked on it, however. She had already decided to pause it first. This video also talked about what happened when the leader disappeared from the radar. Having failed to emphasize any useful information for herself, she leaned back in her chair with a weary sigh, asking in the void if human lives were so simple. The next moment, her attention was caught by the phone on the table, which pinged with a notification that immediately displayed a link. Without hesitation, the girl clicked on the message, opening a chat room with the person who had sent her the message. With her mood completely ruined, she couldn't stop biting her nails, staring at her phone, waiting for the chat room to open and load. The person she was talking to, seeing that she was online, asked if she really didn't know where the master was. She aggressively replied that she didn't know and was also upset. And in response to the answering messages with a question about whether they wrote to her as well as to him from the investigation program and whether she was invited for an interview, the girl tiredly exhaled. And then asked back, did he really think she'd be called? And it was better to let him ignore them as she did. After all, it was hopeless either way. As if sensing that she didn't want to talk about it, the interlocutor decided to change the subject and said that now, the game without a leader is not the same as it was. The next message about whether she wanted to switch to another game threw the girl into a stupor. She hadn't thought about it until she was asked. Without waiting for an answer, her conversation partner threw her a link to the game and asked her to check it out, not forgetting to tell her that it was trending right now. Upon opening the link, she was immediately presented with a beautiful loading picture of the game, complete with knights and a hint of a fully open world. After looking at everything, she decided that it might be worth trying to play the game, and then quickly sent out a link to the game, uploading the message as a guild notification. Seo Charon, one of the guild masters, opened the download window once again, where there was still no connection with the engineer. Then she wondered thoughtfully if something had really happened to their leader. Her partner, who was strangling some beast, asked where the hell the man who had been training for the last 16 hours was. Seo Charon looked away and thoughtfully replied that perhaps he had lost consciousness, and she had noticed that many players were now passing out due to overexertion. Jun Dekyung came closer to her and said that at this rate, the title of the first ranker of the guild would be taken away. There wasn't much difference between being the first ranker and being the guild leader. At this moment, right above their heads, a loud announcement of the guild's urgent notification sounded. When it opened, both girls saw a simple release notice that said Astrum's surreal game had finally been announced, and they should be ready for an announcement about the opening schedule. The trailer revealed that their guild plans to form a new alliance in the surreal game Astrum, and so, to those who would like to conquer the new game, was asked to let you know about it in the general guild chat. The girls watching had more questions than answers. One of them asked the other one what it was. She said that it looked like their guild master wanted to check out the new game first. Meanwhile, life continued unabated in the high-rise building where the Astrum software developers were located. Two people, a guy and a girl with a folder in their hands, were scrutinizing the man lying on a bed in the ward. The guy lying there had long been connected to the machine connecting him to the game. However, it seemed as if he was just sleeping soundly. The developer guy watching him was clearly nervous that he wasn't waking up. It was really weird and really scary, especially since the ones in the other rooms had been awake for a week. Turning to the girl behind him, he told her that he was making an emergency request. He told her to tell him if the boy didn't come to his senses. On the way to the door, he was still sweating from fear and nerves. The guy understood perfectly well that there was no problem with the game itself. The game itself was developed entirely by artificial intelligence, so even he, as the developer, has absolutely no access to it. And in fact, the developer was very scared to think about what would happen if his boss found out about it. At the very least, he'd be sure to rebuke him. When he got to the conference room, the guy started talking about how they sent him one of 100 beta testers from 20 countries around the world, but the guy never woke up. Lowering his head, the developer trembled in fear, but still continued to say that that guy was still in the artificial intelligence system, and then asked if he should ask to stop development. His boss took off his glasses and, holding his face, asked what the condition of those who woke up was. The developer replied that with the exception of the team leader, the results were the same as before. The room fell into dead silence for a while. The boss was thinking about what to do, and the developer didn't dare to say a word. The next moment, the developer looked up in surprise when he heard the boss tell him to keep testing, and perhaps the reason lies in the leader himself. The one continued to say with a smile that if the problem was only with the last test, they better think about it and pay close attention to it. Looking at the sky above him, the monsters and animals of this forest, the guy couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. He knew for a fact that none of the players had logged in for days, and since he was the leader of the team, it was stressing him out. A week ago, he and his team had enthusiastically decided to attack and dispose of a lone cave devil right in its lair. So, led by the team leader, rushed swiftly in his direction, armed with all manner of weapons. However, in the next instant, as soon as the demon stood on two legs and roared loudly and menacingly, after that, the entire team behind the leader as if vaporized, and he was left alone. The leader, who did not immediately notice it, stopped and turned to stare at the place where they had been. The monster, too, clearly surprised by this turn of events, also stopped, staring at the man in front of him. The next instant he turned and fearfully ran forward from the demon with a shriek, realizing with shame that there was no way he could catch up with the fleeing team. This whole situation made him shiver with shame every time he thought of her. In fact, he wished he could forget about her forever. Now he wasn't sure what he should do next. There was one online raid during dinner tonight, and from the looks of it, if he refused, the developers would find out about it. At this moment, a huge monster appeared right in front of him, climbing straight out of the water, hoping to catch him off guard. However, the guy quickly noticed him and hurriedly bounced away from the spot where the monster's powerful blow had struck. And then, closely following the monster's actions, he drew his sword and used it to repel its next powerful attack, which was to chop it in two. After a short battle, still holding the block, the guy carefully looked at the monster, feeling that he wouldn't last long like this and was about to be overtaken by the monster's sword blade. At that moment, the system notified him that the training had already been selected, and he began to slowly disappear from the monster's sight. The monster stared in shock at the spot where the boy had been standing before. Now that the dust cloud had cleared, he could clearly see that he had disappeared somewhere, leaving an empty space behind. It didn't bother him at all, but rather embarrassed him. He thought with a chuckle that it had disappeared so suddenly, and that was probably because the monster was quite strong. The boy in turn made his way to the village, where after announcing that training had begun, he began swinging his sword, practicing techniques. As he began to put his sword back into its scabbard with a breath, the other players began to wonder who he was that was wandering around out there waving his sword around. The player turned his head to the side with boredom. In fact, he could not understand what had happened again. This is already the 13th beta. He didn't understand how come there was still training. After all, when the game is updated, the player does not need to go through the tutorial again. Besides, it's just a village. Looking at the players laughing and discussing something, he couldn't figure out if this was really another beta. While he was thinking about how they were just nerds with nothing better to do, a girl coming up behind him called out to him, apologizing. When she saw him turn to her, the girl asked him in a friendly manner if he was a user. Then she said that she just didn't see the difference between a user and an NPC. His face twisted at the fact that someone had come so easily to ask him about something. He had a feeling that something was about to happen. The next instant, he was hit in the face by a sudden pop-up blue system window. Holding his face, the guy read that the player was talking to him, and he could choose a response based on their proximity and the content of the conversation. The guy tried to say something himself, but at the same moment, he was surprised to find that he couldn't use his voice. Shocked at what was happening, he couldn't understand why the crappy system had changed. The system beeped with new messages that screen generation had already started, and he has a close connection with the user, from which two question options are available to him. He quickly clicked the first option, thinking for a moment that he had actually seen it all somewhere before. And then, in a mechanical voice with a stone face, he asked her how she found this place. The girl, in her turn, quickly realized and said that she understood that he was just a NPP. It didn't come to the player immediately. However, when he realized everything, he fell into holy terror. Everything was right. He was just a NPCs. In the company building, the developer leisurely typed in the access code to the player's chamber, still in awe of what was happening. Walking into the room, the first thing he did was head in the direction of the guy, and then stopping in front of him, he stared at him silently, hoping he could make things right. The flash drive he held in his hand shook with it. The developer really didn't know whether to start the reboot or not. Not thinking long, the guy still inserted a reloadable flash drive into the socket. After all, it might have helped. After a few hours of observation, he noticed that he had no health problems so far. But if he keeps doing what he's doing, the player could easily die, and it doesn't matter if he had health problems. So, reaching out with a trembling hand to the key that was supposed to start the process, he doubted whether it was worth it. He pressed the button and quickly withdrew his hand, still daring to take this responsible step, but he was still scared to think about what would happen if he failed. The guy lying on the bed was breathing calmly and measuredly, giving no sign that anything had gone wrong, which meant that so far everything was going well. The developer, meanwhile, sank his face into his hands with regret, unable to bear the weight of the burden he was carrying. He didn't know what he would do next, but something had to be done and something had to be sacrificed. The soldiers in chainmail encircled the monsters, apparently made of wood and mud, and holding their swords at the ready prepared to attack them. And in the next instant, they rushed at the monsters with loud shouts. One of them easily chopped apart the tree-shaped monster. The second one with a loud shout chopped the mud monster, which didn't even try to resist it in any way. He easily attacked and repelled the attacks of the wood and mud monster, which were clearly not going to just give up and were not harmless at all. Unable to watch this absurdity any longer, the player called out loudly to the trainee, distracting him from the battle with the monsters. As soon as he turned his back to the monster, it immediately attacked him from the back, striking at the shield hanging on him. Listening to the guy apologize and make excuses, the player silently put his hand to his forehead, staring at the ground as if there was something interesting there. Exhaling tiredly, without taking his hand away from his face, he wondered how on earth he had managed to get involved with such idiots. After a while, he, in a mechanical voice, slowly asked the girl standing in front of him who she was and how she found this place. The girl was tensed by his tone. She didn't understand if he was coming at her or if he was just a normal NPC. Smiling tensely, the girl explained that she had stumbled upon the place simply while exploring the area. Then she asked how long he'd been there. At that moment, a choice window appeared in front of the guy. After the lines about what kind of chat window it was, it showed two answer options to choose from. Both options seemed too horrible for the guy. The first said he couldn't say. The second said it had only been a short time since he'd gotten there. After thinking about both options, he chose the second and said in a mechanical voice that not much time had passed since he had arrived there. Seeing the table that popped up after his words with the option to choose whether he wanted to continue the conversation or not, the guy thought that was what he needed. In his head, he quickly repeated the question of why she was looking for other people over and over again, and he was pretty good at it. In reality, however, he still with a stony mechanical voice asked in syllables why she was looking for other people. The girl readily and vividly replied that it was all because she thought to familiarize herself a little with the place, and not only that, but also to help the villagers. The system immediately notified the guy that he'd learned more information about the Pollywog, and his affinity level increased by 1%. After reading the question as to whether he would be willing to give her a quest, the guy happily started to talk about the assignment, but stopped talking halfway through. At this point, the system suddenly detected an incorrect access level and has now gone into emergency mode. The guy in turn was electrocuted so badly that he could only scream loudly, unable to do anything else. In his room, where he was still connected to his computer, the developer sat with his face in the palms of his hands, unsure of what to do next. With a glance at the red light, the developer looked in horror at the computer in the corner. There on the monitor, a red warning light lit up that there were no access rights, so the automatic switch to emergency mode was activated. Still not taking his hands off his face, the developer wondered aloud if, after all, the guy had died from this. This dog diction made him really scared. He couldn't believe that he had actually done all this, and a man had died because of it. At that moment, the guy being tested got up from the bed behind him and approached the sitting guy, who didn't notice him, from the back. The developer, as if sensing his approach, quickly turned around and at the same moment screamed loudly in shock and horror. He wasted no time in quickly jumping from the chair to the table, watching in horror as the player fell to the floor and stood in a push-up stance. And then, without wasting time, he began to do push-ups from the floor, obviously not waking up and not coming to his senses, but doing everything on automatic. The developer had been sitting there all this time, looking at the guy with incomprehension and horror, not understanding exactly what he was doing. Putting his hand to his face, the guy decided to think about how he would tell his superiors about everything that was going on. Even imagining how he would report that this guy died and then suddenly started doing push-ups, he'd probably say he thought he was an idiot. It was all very strange and scary. The guy really didn't understand why this was all happening to him. Meanwhile, everything in the leader's house was in order. Not a speck of dust, not a mess, not a sound. Everything sparkled with cleanliness and order, as if it had been prepared for the queen's visit. Everything was in its place, every room was neatly cleaned, every corner was illuminated with sunlight. Standing at the mirror, the girl washed her face and looked at her reflection in the mirror with a sad exhale. And then removing the rubber band from her hair, she slowly raised her hand and flung her dark locks back over her shoulders, walking confidently and calmly into the hall. Lying on the couch, the girl regretfully thought that now she had only this place, the leader's haven, the leader's post, and nothing else. All the time since their leader had disappeared, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about him. She just couldn't stop thinking about whether he would ever come back, or whether he was already dead. The next moment, a text message that came to her phone made her jump up from the couch she was lying on in surprise. Looking at the message on the locked screen, she noticed that the message was from Astrom's researcher. So wiping her tears with her fingers, she asked in wonder into the void what had happened again, what he was writing to her. The message told the guildmaster not to worry about the leader because he was going to return, and the message was followed by some sort of video. Clicking on which, the girl was surprised to see a recording of their guild leader, wearing glasses and wearing a headset on his head, vigorously doing push-ups on the floor, ignoring requests to come to his senses. The girl, still in holy shock, immediately jumped up from where she had been sitting before. Now all her apathy was gone in a flash. Unable to take her eyes off the screen, she covered her mouth with her palm and cried again, unable to believe that the guild leader was actually alive. Meanwhile, in the game space, the engineer slowly came to his senses, not immediately realizing where he was and what this place really was. Rubbing his neck and shoulders and shaking his head, he thought he was even wondering if everything was okay with the game. It was possible, of course, that there was something wrong with the power supply, or something like that. While thinking about it, he suddenly heard some strange sound, and with surprise, quickly turned around towards it. A notification immediately appeared above his head that access to his system had been detected, and so the system would block all external paths. In addition, the system has notified him that it is entering emergency operation mode. As a result, a small electrical stimulation will be applied to the user. Before he could even think about what kind of electrostimulation it was, his whole body was hit with a tremendous amount of current, making him scream in pain. The system continued to inject current into his body, as well as notifying him that to ensure the user's protection, the training was forcibly completed, and it was triggering the start of the game. The player in turn could barely lift his head, clenching his jaw with force, and now reading the system's notification, which didn't give him a long respite and sent him flying from where he was at the same instant. In the next instant, the guy was already flying headlong into this game space at a tremendous speed, with a cry of pain. After that, the player's body began to peer and rearrange itself, and he was screaming for someone to just turn the damn thing off and be done with the damn thing. However, all his pleas and cries were useless. The system sent him back anyway, not forgetting to wish him a good and enjoyable game. The guy was carried towards the ground at breakneck speed like a meteor and plummeted down into the dense green of the game forest. He rested his hands on the ground where he had fallen, breathing hard after all his experiences in that strange place. Getting up, he turned his head and looked around. Apparently it was already over, but he somehow couldn't believe it. The next moment, a huge crate fell down right in front of him, thus scaring the guy who didn't expect it. Looking at it, the engineer thought that it seemed to be a reward for completing the training. But he couldn't believe that one chest could make so much noise. Upon opening it, the guy immediately thought that he was indeed right. This was the resource chest that everyone needed so badly. He pulled the sword out of there as well, with the thoughts that he had years of experience playing RPGs under his belt, which is why he's good at it all. At the same moment, he was surprised to find a piece of paper in the drawer, signed and wishing good luck to the head of the Polar Bear Knights. When he opened it, he stared in amazement at the mission and its items written there. He was horrified and stunned by the fact that the system had definitely written it. The guy still turned his head to the side in surprise. There was probably a breakdown in real life after all, and now this was all happening. He wanted to start reading what was written on the paper, but he stopped himself from reading it, because now was not the time for that. Putting the piece of paper in his pocket, the guy thought it was very strange that he was in the game, but it still hurt. But first he had to think about how to disable Astrom from the inside. Later, the engineer raised his hand to the sky and pathetically shouted the words to get out of the system and this game. However, despite his best efforts, nothing happened, and he remained standing with his hand raised, looking at the birds flying through the sky. Without thinking for long, he raised his hands again, and with a strange expression on his face, he once again spoke the words to exit the system of this game world. He was so filled with the desire to finally leave this game world that he even missed the moment when someone hit him in the face with a huge hammer. From the force of this blow, the engineer flew far away from the place he was standing on, picking up all the bumps and rocks along the way. The guy who hit him headed in his direction, with a mocking smile saying that it was worth it to finally beat up these NPCs who were annoying him. And the player himself, lying on the ground, was still recovering from that blow, watching the shadow come closer and closer. At this point, the system has notified him that he has taken damage from the user's attack, and now he can attack his opponent, and he can also achieve new achievements by interacting with others. Ignoring the player swinging his hammer at him again, the engineer smiled madly at the message that came to him. All this time he had been in the gaming world, he had felt like a dog in so many ways, but now the arrogant bastard had finally been caught. Without thinking long, he rushed with great speed away from the blow that hit the ground, and bypassing the guy, quickly found himself behind him. Taking the sword out of its sheath, he thought about how he didn't really know where the guy came from, but if he thought the guy was an NPPS too, he'd be very wrong. That fatty turned around as well, and looking at the man standing in front of him in surprise, asked why he was even moving like a player. In the next instant, the lad came quickly nearer and swung his axe again, asking how he liked it and whether he could do anything against it. The engineer in turn avoided his blow again, and running past in the other direction, struck him back with his sword. The player angrily thought that for some reason this NPC is very fast, so much so that he can't keep up with it but still attacks weakly. The one he was thinking of, in turn, suddenly reappeared in front of the guy with a creepy grin, delivering another sword strike to his body. The NPCs seemed to feel no resistance from him at all, attacking him again and again with thoughts of killing him while he was in a bad mood. Fatty, who had received a few more blows, asked loudly if this was definitely a beginner's village, and then shouted contentedly and prepared to attack himself. The engineer in turn quickly blocked his blow, a smile on his face the entire time. In fact, he hadn't realized that the beginner's village had been officially released, but he didn't need to know that because he was already playing well, so he certainly wouldn't need it. Quickly approaching the guy, he swung his sword at his arm, causing him to release the hammer he was holding with a loud cry of pain. With that done, he prepared to deliver the final blow, thinking that if this wasn't all a game, the fatty was now definitely finished. Running past him again, he effortlessly landed several more powerful blows to the fatty's body. It was only when he began to fade away with curses, having been defeated, that the engineer stopped and began to lay his sword back in its scabbard. Looking at the empty space left by the fatty, he unfurled his hair with his hand and said haughtily, like an adult who prides himself on taking candy away from a child, that it's still very good to have control. The next moment, a system notification appeared in front of him, stating that he had avoided the attacks and blocked the user's lunges. As a reward, he was given a new achievement and the ability to attack the user without taking damage. The guy stared at him in shock. This achievement apparently meant that it would now be possible to attack first. However, the system immediately tempered his fervor, and ignoring his outraged cries, notified him that he would now be punished for killing the user. In the real world, meanwhile, 10 days had passed since the engineer's disappearance, and now, Astrum was officially open to all players. In the company of the creators of Astrum, in the development room, all the developers were in complete shock. The artificial intelligence opened the game by itself, and nobody understood what was going on, because even the test was not completed. They asked each other if they had sent out an official statement, and whether they had finished processing the data sent by the artificial intelligence. At that moment, a man ran into the room and shouted that the official decree had been published and yesterday's tasks had been accomplished. Pulling a piece of paper in their direction, he panted and said that the printer had printed it. And in response to a question about what it said, he said that there were no problems and the server was open. Meanwhile, in the thicket of the game forest, the player was patiently coaching the two knights, periodically pointing out their mistakes and telling them that they should raise the end of the sword higher. The two guys who were practicing immediately replied in unison that what he told them to do would be done. Then they looked at each other and laughed loudly. The player, meanwhile, is thinking about the fact that he can't get out of there. This game and the game space are just keeping him there. One of their knights approached him with sparkling eyes, asking if all this and training would increase their strength. Thoth unfurled his hair a bit, and without looking at it haughtily said that it had to be cool to gain any power. After listening to him, both knights looked at each other in surprise without saying a word. And then, looking at him with eyes full of adoration, paying no heed to his condition, exclaimed joyfully that they would know. While the guy was trying to deal with his gagging and thoughts that nothing was going to happen, both guys were laughing happily. Standing up, he looked towards the guys and said with a smile that he now realized that was all that mattered, and that would be the end of it. He didn't realize if he had to do what he was told at the end, but still, the player now had his arms folded across his chest and was silently watching the soldiers practicing. In the next instant, the guy told them to stop, and then picked up the helmets lying on the ground. They immediately stopped and stood straight as if in a straight line, looking at the boss approaching them with helmets. Thoth didn't waste much time on unnecessary conversation, and quickly pressed their helmets onto the heads of both of them, thinking that he had no choice but to try. And then looking at them both with enthusiasm, he said that their next fight would be a real one. The system didn't take a nap either, and gave the player a new mission. He had to capture 4 soldiers to reach level 20, and in addition to penalties in case of violation of the conditions, he could not leave the kingdom. Looking at all of this, the guy tiredly thought it was infuriating, and the fine pisses him off every time he sees it. Telling them to wait, the player said that he would first go on a reconnaissance, thinking to himself that he had to bet on something or someone anyway. The soldiers accompanying him took it differently, and decided that since he even does all the dirty work himself, it's really cool. The guy, meanwhile, was trotting through the woods, purposefully looking for some place that was supposed to be just there. Pulling out his sword, he quickly chopped through the nearest bushes, thinking that if this was an adequate game, they must have hidden it. He continued chopping bushes and thinking about the fact that, by the by, that sound would have to come when he found the right spot. At that moment, the system distracted him from what he was doing by informing him that a user was approaching him, and she was customizing the status window to suit the situation. The system immediately informed him that he could ignore the connection and assign the quest. The player, meanwhile, had already approached and awkwardly said hello, telling the surprised guy that he had heard there were quest mobs dwelling there. However, he found none of them there. The guy listening to him immediately remembered how his soldiers had recently taken down all the quest mobs with ease. The guy turned away awkwardly, and at that moment, a notification from the system appeared above his head. Ignoring the player who greeted him once more, the guy stared at the choices given to him. The system also notified him that the selection window would be changed to fast mode for further convenience. Putting the sword back into its scabbard, the player said in a mechanical voice that if he was looking for a monster, he would find it in the Rat Cave dungeon. Without waiting for a response from the player, he quickly chose another phrase, and inwardly burning with shame, said that if the player found the Rat Cave, he would give him a small reward. Raising his head, he and the player stared at the quest that appeared above their heads, which stated that the traveler had to find a dungeon where rats were hiding. The quest details said that they are not available to NPCs due to lack of proximity, and the reward could not be confirmed because of the same. And the very player who had been given this quest was looking at the window with sparkling eyes, not believing that he had actually been given the quest. So turning to the NPCs, began to beg him to grant the quest to him, right in front of his eyes, panting with impatience. From the NPC's perspective, his face looked even more vile and disgusting than it could have been, but even so, the boy didn't stop begging him. Looking at this theater of the absurd, the guy vomited. Now he realized that this player was just indescribably greedy. Shaking his head, getting rid of all those thoughts, the guy thought that this is what it looks like what gaming addicts do. He clicked on one of the choices given to him, but didn't have time to finish saying that, then left it up to him. The player disappeared at the same instant. Without looking at that spot, the player leaned over and shook his head again, trying to figure out what he was doing, and how he would end up being rewarded for the task. With a whistle, he called out to the soldiers who had been left behind. In any case, he was sure he would find her himself. Meanwhile, the main location was buzzing with life after the company officially announced the server launch. The players of the last guild, led by their head, came there to explore the area, and the girl with blonde hair cheerfully said that she could even smell it. The girl with the scar on her face replied, meaning that's why everyone is moving so quickly at Astrum. The head said that they needed to register with the guild first before they lost their names. Hearing Charon say that she wanted clothes like hers, she turned around and menacingly spelled out in syllables that first, they should form a guild. The girl immediately became fearfully silent, starting to whimper with resentment and ignoring her friend, who exhaled in relief. As they traveled through town to the administration building, they were watched the whole way by some guy the girls never noticed. Meanwhile, in the game forest, the player, along with the soldiers for convenience, stacked all the weapons on the ground. After an hour of shoveling the ground in this forest, their location had changed more than once, but they still couldn't find anything. The player looked around in astonishment as he took a break from his work. The player looked around in surprise, but what was strange about the whole situation was that it was either a rat den or a cave at the moment. At that moment, the player to whom he had given the task appeared from the bushes, and with a laugh, said that he thought he would hide in a cave, because the dungeon is called a rat cave. Ignoring the skewed face of the guy in front of him, he spoke with a crazy smile about how it wasn't really like that at all. Raising his head up and pointing in that direction with his hand, the guy said that in fact, the rat cave is over there. The system immediately notified them that the quest was completed and that this user had found the rat cave. In addition to experience points, the NPCs could also choose any reward and give it to the user. He looked at the rewards, which included a packet of assignments from the kingdom's vigilante, a handwritten memorandum, and 2 bars of gold, and wondered. The memorandum wouldn't have been enough, but he couldn't believe they'd actually given him gold. When he saw the guy, oozing with juice, start to choose something from what was offered, he panicked and quickly chose the first of the options offered to him. And then shaking his hand, he mechanically thanked him for everything he'd done. And then shaking his hand, he spoke in a mechanical voice, thanking him for everything he'd done. Watching the guy's level rise, he told him in a mechanical voice to follow the assignment link if he still wanted the assignment. The guy in turn, as if he hadn't heard him, and only when he repeated several times what he'd said did he finally stop cheering at the reward. Clicking on the link, the guy immediately turned around and walked away, humming to himself that he should click on the assignment link. Meanwhile, the player, having finally waited for this moment, turned back and decided that he had to completely clean out the rat cave first. Turning to the already armed soldiers, he asked if they had heard what the traveler had said, and then ordered that not a single rat be left alive. They immediately scattered in different directions, once again chopping the nearest bushes apart with their swords. As soon as the guy approached one of the trees where the den was located, the rats immediately attacked him. After that, he told everyone to retreat. He realized that there was a mission order. Only after the user completed the mission given to him did the rodents start to appear. Noticing that there were quite a few of them, the player turned to the soldiers and suggested that they cover each other, and then told them to pay more attention to the small trees. Looking around, he thought, what was crucial was that the difficulty level was too easy. With thoughts that there must be something else, taking his sword tighter, he rushed to the farthest huge tree. Not understanding what the game wanted from him, the player, not thinking long, jumped towards the tree and kicked it with his foot with force. Jumping down, looking at the trail left by his blow, the player menacingly told the boss to finally crawl out of his lair. Meanwhile, in the guild office that the girls finally reached, the head quickly approached and slammed the administration desk with force. Looking into the eyes of the admin girl, she confidently said that their guild name was the last guild, and that same name would be their signature. The girl in turn replied with a smile that someone had come and occupied it yesterday. She was really sorry, but the name had already been registered. The head was infuriated by this answer, and she loudly asked which crazy bastard had taken their name. Then she told him to tell her the name of the guild master. After opening the registered guild, the girl pointed to some guy's picture and said that this name was taken by Song-Soo Best Player. The guy in the game forest was still standing by the tree, holding his sword at the ready for any turn. In the next instant, a huge number of sharp spikes flew from the tree towards him, clearly aimed at killing him, which he quickly dodged. And a strange brown creature began to fall from the tree immediately afterward, which was apparently the boss. The guy immediately bounced away from where he had fallen, thinking that the boss had finally arrived. The boss quickly ran past him and then turned and ran back. Looking at the squeaky and menacing-looking hedgehog running towards him, the guy could only think about why the hell he was straight up so cute. It was even pathetic to realize that he had to chop this hedgehog into 2 pieces. But still, without thinking about it for long, the player prepared for the attack. In the next instant, a system notification appeared right in front of his eyes that a secret mission had appeared, and since the third requirement to complete the mission had been found, the mission had been created. Looking at it, he was reminded of a paper he had once gotten his hands on, which at first had a good luck wish on it. And after the guy turned it around, he saw the mission that was available to him, and just at that moment, he noticed one of the items that said it was a hidden mission. Like when he saw the paper, the fact that this mission and item was hidden, it shocked and bewildered him, even when he thought back on it. As he thought about it, and then raised his head, the hedgehog came flying towards him at a great speed. The system notified him that on the third point, he had to tame the boss by any means possible. The guy who had not expected such a setup screamed loudly. He didn't understand how the system imagined how he would tame the beast, but to be fair, the system actually had a catch. After some time had passed since they began to fight, the white flag was finally raised, signifying that the enemies were surrendering. The monsters that had recently tried to destroy the soldiers were now barely able to breathe or do anything. The soldiers, also breathing heavily, could hardly stand on their feet after all that had happened. When they heard sounds behind them, they quickly turned in that direction. In the next instant, they quickly dropped the swords in their hands and rushed towards where the engineer was. The one in turn easily evaded the blast the hedgehog had set off, breaking with his hands and looking directly at the spot where the hedgehog had been. In all this chaos, the angry hedgehog, with eyes glittering with rat-like light, wasn't very noticeable, but that was what made it tense. For a while, the guy just stood silently and watched as this cutest creature slowly approached him, with a clear desire to kill. The engineer's face slowly cut into a mocking smile as it approached him. He said haughtily, looking at the hedgehog, "It's all a small thing, really," and he wondered why he hadn't obeyed yet. Without waiting for an answer, which there was no way there would be, He pulled some kind of potion out of his pocket, saying that Daddy was angry now. Throwing it at the hedgehog, the engineer watched as his health bar quickly began to drop after colliding with the contents of the bottle. It was short-lived, however, and within a second the hedgehog was up again, looking in amazement at the full health bar that had restored itself. The guy in turn, looking him straight in the eyes with a smile, told him to go over there, because he knows that he wants to tell him that if he dared to hit him, he will not live. The hedgehog, hearing what he had been told, rushed at the fellow with great speed, like a bull that had been shown a red rag. The one in turn didn't even try to dodge as he watched the dark furry creature fly straight at him, and then he took and pulled back his middle finger, activating a special guild master skill that hit enemies randomly and would only be activated if it hit the forehead of the enemy. The hedgehog obviously did not expect this, but now in flight, approaching the enemy could not dodge nor do anything to protect himself. From what, and at the same moment flew away, struck by a strong blow on the forehead far forward from the guy, not having the strength to resist him. The soldiers, in turn, tried to go through the bushes and find the guy by his footsteps, saying that he had indeed apparently gone that way. Right before their eyes, the hedgehog lying on the ground and damaged jumped up, and with a lump on his forehead and tears in his eyes, shouted loudly in the direction of the guy who had hit him. He ignored his angry outbursts and asked if he had to repeat it 10 more times. In that case, they would build a perfect hierarchical relationship. The soldiers, in turn, covered their eyes and shook their heads as if they saw nothing, wondering why he was like that. Meanwhile, in the novice village, it was surprisingly quiet as for a game world with a huge number of new players. In the main square, that fatty Song Su was loudly attracting the attention of the players, offering to help them invest in stocks for 1 gold. He also offered his services as a cryptocurrency broker. While he was shouting about it to the entire square, he suddenly received a call and apologetically asked if he was Song Su, the master of the last guild. He replied in surprise that he was right, and he was indeed Song Su. When asked where he was now, he asked if the girl needed help with cryptocurrency. This answer put the girl in a stupor, and she, looking at her giggling friend, asked why she should buy cryptocurrency and whether the rate will really start to grow rapidly in the near future. At any rate, the guy's answer to that question satisfied her, and she thought with a smile that in that case, she would easily find this player, given what he had said. Song Su, meanwhile, never left the plaza, offering his services to others for 1 gold through his mouthpiece. He offered help from a bug that had been there since beta testing to investing money in stocks. Meanwhile, the leader was already heading towards him, and the people she passed by were wondering who this girl was and if she was really in the top of the best. The girl herself, however, paid no attention to those around her, walking over to a guy with a mouthpiece sitting by the bushes. Quickly approaching him, she asked in a joyful voice with a feigned smile if he was Song Su's best. His face twisted in surprise that such a stunning girl had come up and was addressing him. Turning away from the girl who was pleased with the effect he had produced, he embarrassedly replied that it was him, and asked how much cryptocurrency she planned to buy. Ignoring his words, the girl took his hand with both of hers and asked him to put matters aside and talk one-on-one. Burning with embarrassment and unable to look at the girl holding his hand, he stammered and asked what this conversation was about. Quickly moving closer to his ear, she replied that the conversation was secret and asked him to sell her the guild. After all, if it was about money, it wasn't a problem. Hearing these words, the boy quickly came to his senses and opened his eyes wide with fleeting surprise. Just as quickly, he pulled his hand from the surprised girl's grip and grabbed one of her arms with the other. The girl continued to stare shocked at the guy, who pathetically replied that none of this was going to be easy at all. With one hand tucking her hair back, he still held her hand, pathosly said that he would separate the guild to the girl after he returned one day as a legend. Meanwhile, the engineer in the game forest was loudly telling the hedgehog to turn his head to the left. He obviously didn't know what he was talking about, so he only turned his head slightly to the right. The guy asked loudly, wondering if he still hadn't come to his senses. The guy asked loudly if he was still out of it, and then he told him to turn quickly to his left, raising his voice over and over again. Even the soldiers were getting tired of it all, and in every way possible were trying to tell the hedgehog what to do, inwardly begging him to just turn to them and finally end it. The hedgehog looked in their direction in silence, not immediately understanding exactly what needed to be done or what they all wanted. The next instant, he was pierced with realization and understanding of everything that had been wanted and tried to be accomplished from him all this time. When he finally turned left, the soldiers breathed a sigh of relief that it was finally over and they wouldn't have to endure it all anymore. Looking at him, the engineer said with a slight smile that it was very good and they could finally communicate normally. No matter how much he thought about it, it was very strange. Why the hell would he even bother taming this weird hedgehog? Quickly banishing all thoughts, he turned to the hedgehog and told him to answer all questions in one syllable from now on. Taking his cap off his head, the guy quickly put it on the hedgehog, saying he was sorry for the bump and it must be very sore. And then, kneeling down with a smile, gently rubbed him on the head with the words that he was with them now, and he was pretty cute. Not expecting this, the hedgehog looked at the guy with sparkling eyes. And then putting his paw to his forehead, he stood up in a straight line. One of the soldiers, looking at this, asked the other if he knew where they got the red cap. The latter replied that he did not know, and it was better not to ask about it. After a while, the engineer approached the soldiers and said he would see how much they had improved their skills. The system showed that one of them was level 32 and the other 32. The rest of their stats, except for loyalty, which remained at 100%. He looked at it and thought to himself that it was just fine. They had reached the mark. They'd tamed the boss, too, but it was unclear why these guys didn't have names. Taking the paper out of his pocket, the boy decided that perhaps he should reread the assignment again. At the same time, there was a battle between players and monsters in Astrom's one playing field. One of the players swiftly dashed between the two monsters in front of him and with a few movements easily chopped them apart. The rest of the monsters he was approaching looked shocked at the scene that had formed. Behind the furnace guy stood the guild leader, who was leisurely activating some spells to help him. Noticing one of the monsters approaching him from behind, she immediately warned him about it. Quickly turning around, he noticed this monster change direction, and with a quick movement of his hand, he launched his sword in his direction. The sword quickly sliced through the torso of the monster that was approaching the girl at a great speed, and it didn't seem to notice it at all. Exhaling tiredly, she finally opened her eyes, having not stopped activating her skills and spell the entire time. Finally activating it, the head raised her hands with huge fireballs upwards, making them even bigger and more powerful than they were. After a bit of thought, she said that apparently the asshole she was trying to negotiate with was a huge fan of their leader. And ignoring the guy who came running up behind him and came to retrieve the sword from the carcass, she stared straight ahead with anger, and then said that she now thinks that this is why modern kids don't play RPGs. Without thinking long, the girl, with a loud shout, let loose huge streams of powerful fire in the direction of the monsters standing in front of her. Her friend in turn said that might even be why even the captain is watching her videos. In addition, she heard that the common playroom had risen to the top of the list. The second girl in turn asked if this guy didn't want anything at all. It was very strange. Without looking at the swordsman guy dealing with the monster and the other monsters burning in flames from the explosion, the girl pronounced that she should be a guildmaster no matter what. But still, if they wanted to form a guild, they would have to unite with the others anyway, and that really annoyed her. Meanwhile, the engineer once again pulled out and opened the piece of paper the system had kindly given him along with the rest of the trophies. Reading longer at what it said, the guy grew more and more morose as he remembered everything that had happened. He was reminiscing about the first time he met a human as a NPCs, and she didn't realize it right away. I remembered the system changing it and before all that beating it with a huge amount of current, and how the system notified him that he would be penalized in the next roll if the user was killed. He still didn't quite understand everything, which made him read and think again and again about what was written there. In the next instant, the system notified him that the mission is complete. He will get extra rewards of the hidden mission, and to collect the rewards he must press yes and the mission will be completed. After reading everything that was written there, the guy without regret tore the paper into two pieces, which now he didn't need. Clutching and crumpling the remains of the paper, he threw it behind his back without looking. Still looking at the system window, he pointed his finger to the side, and activating the skill segued that piece of paper to the ground. Now he understood, and after a bit of silence, he smiled and said that for the game to progress, the system needed him. When he asked if this was the case, the system answered nothing, leaving a blank dialogue box hanging. After a while neither the guy nor the system said anything, the system dialogue box finally disappeared completely, leaving nothing behind. With a flick of his poles, the guy accidentally activated the fire again, which immediately appeared between them. He didn't notice it at all, thinking that he was really underestimated. Not paying attention to the soldiers and the hedgehog, he thought that all this was actually very normal, because in this game, he was the best. Finally letting his head down, the guy noticed a light puff of smoke coming from his fingers upward, which put him in a stupor for a moment. In the next instant, he finally reacted normally, and looking at his hand with horror, he thought the thing had really scared him badly. And a second later, he remembered how back in the days of closed beta testing, he and some acquaintances had stumbled upon a camel in the desert. Without a second thought, the whole team immediately ran to kill the camel, not even knowing why. Remembering how he had been the first to reach the camel with a crushing blow, the engineer thought that, judging by the looks of it, it meant that the skills remained the same as in the closed beta. He held his finger up. He reignited the fire on it, thinking that this was indeed amusing. Staring fascinated at the fire burning on his finger, the boy thought about the fact that fire is really very cool. Suddenly, that fire went out right in front of his surprised eyes. The system notified him that he didn't have enough mana. Without wasting time, he quickly put out the remains, turning away from the others with thoughts that this was truly shameful. The soldiers, meanwhile, pretended as if they hadn't seen anything at all. The hedgehog, in turn, pulled his cap over his eyes, hurrying to follow the soldier's example and pretend he hadn't seen anything. Confused at what had happened, the boy coughed and pronounced that they should head back to the village first. After a while, they finally reached the main gate of the village. The soldiers, in turn, laughed loudly, happy to have finally reached her. In the next instant, the hedgehog and the engineer behind them suddenly collided with some obstacle. The two soldiers ahead of them immediately turned around at the same time, as well as the others, not expecting such a turn of events. The player leaned his hands on the barrier, asking in bewilderment what the hedgehog was and why it was there in the first place. Apparently, the hedgehog agreed with him and repeated after him. The soldiers shockedly asked why on earth they couldn't get through, and maybe they had just done something really bad. The guy didn't answer, trying to squeeze in, but he faced a barrier that didn't move. Realizing that it was all useless, he turned the other way, not realizing if it was all because it was a closed region. The guy turned his head to the side, thinking about what he could do in such a situation. And then, lowering his head, looked at the hedgehog at his feet, with the realization of some idea of his own. The one in turn looked back at him the same way, sensing that something was wrong. Turning his attention to the soldiers, he asked them to wait. They, in turn, were still staring at him in shock. With a creepy grin, the guy picked up the hedgehog, waving it around with words to make sure they didn't get hurt. Meanwhile, back at the company's office, there was an oppressive atmosphere of despair in Astrum's developer's room. Suddenly, the system displayed a notification that a bug was detected in the game system, and an attempt to access the closed game system was made. If this fails, Plan B will be used. The developer sitting across from the window tiredly said that they've blocked it, but they still don't have access. And he doesn't understand what the point of this is at all. The principal entered the room, and everyone immediately jumped up from their seats to say hello to him. The one in turn paid no attention to them and didn't respond, asking if the host was having problems again. Hearing the response of the man walking behind him saying that they were getting closer to understanding the rules of the game, he angrily asked what rules. The developer nervously replied that it looked like the main event was finally locked down. Only once he was on his own in the game world did he think about the fact that he never thought it would eventually come to this. Standing silently on his way into town, he tried to figure out how the hell things had gotten to this point, and why him. As he approached the gathered crowd, he thought, he didn't think it could be directly so intimidating. It was only when he got very close to those gathered that he saw that in front of them, at the gate, stood guards who would not let anyone in. Suddenly, he was horrified to see one of the players grab his head and shriek loudly. This guy in turn was screaming in terror and despair just because he felt very strongly about his quest. As he approached the guards, he asked excitedly what they were going to do, thinking that he hadn't really heard about it yet. The guard replied that he was blocked from entering the kingdom, and so he asks him to turn around nicely. Ignoring the clearly insane player behind him, the developer began to slowly realize what was really going on. With trembling hands, he took off his glasses and said that he thought it was all connected with the engineer, and so he should go to him secretly and ask him about the situation. Remembering the creepy look on the headmaster's face as he took off his glasses, he thought that especially this needed to be done to prevent their collapse and the end he had spoken of. This whole situation was making him desperate. He had no idea how to do this or how to get to the engineer. Apparently, he was already going as crazy as the very player behind him too, but that still didn't change the fact that he was totally fucked. During beta testing, players, along with the leader, attacked a lone cave king intending to capture him. However, after a while, they all disappeared except for the engineer who was left alone against this demon. They didn't actually escape in that meme. The system moved them from that place to some other place. A few days later, the system moved and left them right in front of the town where the closed event was being held. One of the players got to his feet and said that he was very happy that he was finally connected to the server. The girl looked at the system window and wondered why her progress had reset. One of the guys replied that it was beta testing, and of course everything was reset, and then suggested to take off this build, since it is not suitable. While he was undressing, no one paid any attention to him, not understanding why they couldn't actually contact the guildmaster, even though he said he was planning to start a guild. The girl agreed with him, but said she'd do it when all their people were online. Meanwhile, the guy had already stripped off all his clothes and offered them a vase to make a fuss. And without waiting for an answer, said that they needed to go back to the cave to catch the lone demon king, along with the guildmaster. Meanwhile, at the entrance to the city, the engineer was still trying to throw a loudly screaming hedgehog over the barrier. The soldiers watched in horror as he repeated the same ritual over and over again, failing time and time again. And this time he failed again, and the hedgehog bounced off the obstacle and flew right into his face. The soldiers watching were horrified. One of them even suggested that the player was a bow. Indeed, the engineer was a bat and the hedgehog a ball. Pulling the barbs out of his forehead, the engineer said with a surprised stare in front of him that it wasn't working after all. Suddenly, a notification from the system appeared right in front of his eyes, telling him to complete the mission first. The system did not limit itself to one message, and eventually wrote that if he wanted to get the reward and complete the mission, he just had to click yes. This made the player laugh. In fact, he didn't expect it to come to this in the end. Quickly pressing select yes, he pronounced that next time he would do it right. After that, the barrier separating him from the soldiers began to slowly disappear before his eyes. Rising to his feet, the player lowered himself with a smile and picked up his cap from the floor and put it on the hedgehog. As the soldiers ran in his direction with cheers, the lad read the system's notification that for a more even progression, he would be given a different role. Next message, the system gave the engineer a mission to become a mentor for the monster and name the depressed slime. Without waiting for his consent, the system immediately began to transfer him to the task location, despite all his indignation. To his horror and surprise, the system transported him to the dungeon, and he didn't understand what to do at all. In the next instant, a chest with a bounty from the system fell right in front of him. The player smiled again and shook his head, wondering if she wasn't even asking his permission now. Meanwhile, the uncomprehending soldiers, to whom he did not even say goodbye, remained standing near the gate. The engineer began to warm up with the words that he had thought about actually playing with the system, but now he was just pissed off. Seeing the hedgehog on his shoulder, who had also gotten into the dungeon with him, the guy scratched his belly. Then he said that he was in a bit of a hurry, and he had to collect the reward. Suddenly, from somewhere from the side came the menacing roar of a monster approaching them. The boy looked in that direction in surprise, not stopping to scratch the hedgehog on his shoulder. The engineer immediately drew his sword and blocked the monster's attack with it, holding the hedgehog down with his other hand. The attacking skeleton retaliated by stepping aside, holding his already broken sword in his hands. The guy in turn backed off as well, holding his sword to keep from flying backwards. And then placing the hedgehog on his shoulder, freed his arm, and began to activate a special guildmaster skill. The fire that appeared in his fingers turned into a pillar of fire, which the engineer immediately threw towards the monster. This pillar of flame seemed to pass through the monster without causing any harm. This pillar of fire was actually created for special occasions. However, there was no need for that, as it was a distraction to take the enemy by surprise. So the guy with the creepy smile immediately approached him, swinging his sword. His blow struck the torso of a monster that wasn't expecting it, and it flew far forward, unable to counter it in any way. Meanwhile, in the village, the team of returnees had already approached the guild administration desk. The lowest of them asked if the name of the last guild had been registered. The admin girl said it was, and then asked if they would like to join the guild. The other players, meanwhile, said nothing, lifting the smallest one up so that he could be seen. He immediately said that there were 4 of them and asked them to introduce themselves, and then said that they were the group that defeated the boss during testing. They want to join the guild because they want to fight alongside the leader. And then he asked them to join too. Looking ahead of him, the fatty thought he finally realized it was an ominous look. This was definitely what he'd been feeling for the past few days. He heard some rustling in the bushes behind him, and he glanced in that direction. Remembering back to the square offering just 1 gold for help with investing in stocks, should anyone happen to need that help. Thinking that this was probably the guy who had tricked him, he knelt down and picked up a small rock lying beneath his feet. Rising again on the Nogri, he turned toward the bush and, asking loudly if he was there, tossed a rock in that direction. However, the fact that nothing happened made him cringe. Turning away from the bush, he shook his head and began to calm himself, saying that he absolutely needed a bodyguard to protect himself. After a while, he was already standing by the tree, looking through the system window and the data available there. After checking all the data, he decided to open the window where there were supposed to be applications to join, and then looked at the application form with surprise, which said that they are the team that defeated the boss during beta testing, and they wished to step into the guild to fight alongside the leader. It was strange to him that such players wanted to join his guild, but still, it pleased him that they were now under him. Deciding that perhaps this was all in all their steps, one more step into the future, The guy immediately decided to click on Approve the application for those wishing to join. Meanwhile, the hedgehog in the dungeon was quietly gnawing on an unknown nut. His calmness was not disturbed even by the bones and skulls of defeated enemies flying in his direction. He sat and watched the engineer deal with all the skeletons that seemed to have no end. He didn't look away from his occupation, even the decapitated body flying in his direction. All this time, an evil smirk never left the player's face. He didn't think it would be this easy. The next instant, Bones flew toward the hedgehog, hitting him in the back of the head and causing him to fall. The engineer did not stop there, and little by little destroyed all the skeletons attacking him with weapons, cutting off their limbs and splitting their skulls into pieces. Suddenly, one of those skeletons behind him pointed a crossbow in his direction, and without wasting time, fired it. However, the arrow never reached the guy himself, having been repelled by a swift sword strike on the tree. And then, without wasting any time, rushed with sword in hand towards the monster that shot at him. As he approached them, he immediately chopped them apart with a few blows, leaving no chance for resistance. Meanwhile, the hedgehog, no longer paying attention to the player dealing with the monsters behind him, went the other way with glittering eyes. Moving closer to the scattered bones, he picked up one of the ones that was more or less intact, and with both paws, he raised it upward like a sword with a joyful cry. In his eyes, this ordinary bone looked really magical, looking at the way the little creature swung the bone. With menacing shouts, the guy put his sword back into its scabbard, finally dealing with everyone. Opening the system window, he scratched his head, with the words that his body was probably a lot lighter now. Without thinking long, the guy immediately clicked on the only icon among all of them with a reward chest inside. Looking at the chest that had fallen in front of him, the engineer said with anticipation that now he would look at what they had finally put there. The first item that fell out was the Soul Collector's earring. It was an artifact used by a legendary potion master who wore it all his life. It gave plus 500 to stamina and mana. It also gave plus 5 to intelligence. The second item was a zookeeper's belt. The classification of this item left a lot to be desired, for the item was in an unclear state, but still, it restored mana and damage to pets and the user. Looking at it, the guy thought that watching him being given items made him feel like a player, but he still needed more information. And in any case, if things really are like that, then things will be different. With these thoughts, he clenched the items in his fist. With thoughts of whether he would suffer further, the engineer told the system window that the mission was complete. She in turn highlighted a new mission for him, which said that he should become a mentor for the monster and give a name to the depressed slime. The guy looking at the mission hesitated. Even though it was a slime mission, he had a completely bad feeling about it. He put his cap back on the hedgehog sitting on his shoulder along with his bone, and then walked deeper into the cave with the words that before he completed the main mission, they should do some more work. After walking there, the engineer didn't find anything, so he stopped and asked the hedgehog where they could find these slimes, because there was nothing there. Having noticed something, the hedgehog started pointing with his paw into the depth of the cave and squeaking loudly, as if to say that that's where he was standing. Turning his head to the side, he actually noticed multicolored puddles all over the walls and ground. But all of these slimes were much different than the slimes he'd imagined. It was all a little different from what he had expected to see. Pulling out his sword, the engineer pointed it towards the tunnel with the slimes, saying that perhaps this was even better. Still holding the sword at the ready, the guy said with a smile, disposing of them without the slightest regret or guilt. The hedgehog on his shoulder also held the bone at the ready like a sword. And then the engineer easily chopped up the 3 slimes that approached him before he could do anything. However, looking at the slimes approaching him, he barely bounced away from them with thoughts that this was something strange and it wasn't that simple. The next thing he knew, the sword was melting from the slime on it, right in front of the shocked guy. Disregarding the hedgehog that had lunged at the bone slime with an angry squeak, the guy told the system to show basic information about the enemy. Hitting the slime with the bone, he looked in amazement at the bone that had melted from it, only half of which was left. The system, meanwhile, notified the guy that all the slime he was seeing was actually acid slime. However, he wasn't intimidated by this, and he grinned evilly and said that in that case, destroying them would be much more fun. Meanwhile, the developer guy had already reached the entrance to the dungeon where the engineer was. Looking at the entrance in bewilderment, he tried to understand why his company was finally doing this to him. Hearing some sounds from inside, the boy shuddered in horror at everything that was happening and what he would have to do. However, he clenched his teeth and decided that if he kept putting this off, he was going to be in trouble. Opening the system window, he thought in bewilderment that this area was still unexplored, so no one other than the leader would poke around. It would still be great if there were more people in this dungeon. He covered his eyes in horror and asked the system to open the equipment window. As he put on his clothes and gear, he thought about how he'd heard that a lot of games give him full outfits, and this damn company is begging for IE and stuff. Finally pushing all thoughts away, the guy took the sword tighter and was about to head towards the entrance to the cave, when suddenly, the system beeped a notification. The system notified him that it was a message sent from the raid captain's guard from his phone, and the sender was Choi Yu-jung. Sighing heavily, he closed his eyes, thinking about the fact that this woman was writing to him again and still wouldn't leave him alone. In the dungeon cave, the hedgehog bitterly lamented the bone fragment that had melted right in his hands, which continued to melt even though the slurry had stopped falling on it. The engineer smiled at him and explained that they were bones, and that was why they melted faster in the mountains. He didn't know the name or data of the monster he'd never seen before, so it was better to find out first. Patting the hedgehog on the head, he said that now that he knew they were acidic, he and the hedgehog would be okay. And Zam asked him not to cry about that stuff. Smiling again, the guy squatted down and told him that since they were there, he'd give him another cool gift. Hearing him, the hedgehog's eyes sparkled again and he began vigorously saying something in his own language. The guy looked at him in shock for a moment, not immediately understanding what he was saying or wanting from him. The next moment, however, he finally realized everything and explained that there was no need to think about it too much. They could kill them without touching them anyway. The hedgehog watched in amazement as he got up from his squat, not realizing what he was really going to do. The guy, meanwhile, raised his sword up and activated the fire on his hand, running it all over the sword. Thus, with a wicked smile, heating it up and activating the Guildmaster's special skill, Flame Aura, he condensed and released the magical power of fire. Releasing the sword from his hand, he tossed it up and began to unwind it so that the force was evenly distributed. And then grabbing it again, activated the practical skill of Exuberant Aura, with which the aura spread everywhere, and shouted for the depressed slug to finally come out. This skill mercilessly slashed all slimes approaching its range. The guy, noticing that the depressive slime still hadn't appeared, drew his sword again and said that if he got rid of all the mobs, the main slime would eventually come out on its own. However, the system quickly tempered his fervor by reminding him that he didn't have enough mana to activate the same skill again. The engineer, who hadn't expected this, turned his head to the side in surprise, not understanding why this had happened. He didn't have time to think long, however, as a large number of slimes were already rushing towards them, seeking revenge. Tightly gripping his sword, he stared ahead, asking the hedgehog who had covered the gloge and shook his head if he thought the guy couldn't do what he wanted without mana. And then, with an angry look on his face, he began pounding all the slimes that came near him, saying that he would pound them until they turned to dust. While he was busy dealing with the slimes, the hedgehog decided to show him something and started beeping loudly to attract attention. Noticing that the guy was finally paying attention to him, he gestured for him to be sure to keep one slime alive. The boy smiled readily and nodded at him, immediately realizing what he wanted to say and show him. After a while, the guy finally disposed of the slimes and walked over to the remaining one, saying he was giving him 50 seconds. Towering menacingly over him like a gloomy cloud, the engineer told him to bring the depressed slug to him while he asks nicely. Slime, in turn, continued to shiver, eyes downcast and as if trying to tell him something. At his question of what he wanted to tell him, the slime turned into some sort of sign pointing his way. Quickly realizing what she wanted, the guy told her to finally show him the way to the depressed slime. When the slime did his job and led him to the depressed slime, the guy praised him and told him to leave, waving his hand, with his other hand covering his eyes from the bright light. The one in turn did not waste time and immediately ran away far away from the guy. The hedgehog squeaked and covered his eyes as well, barely looking at the picture before him even with his cap on his head. Lowering his head, the guy tiredly exhaled and sarcastically muttered that this slime was really hard to see. It wasn't difficult at all, considering that the place where the slime was illuminated by a bright yellow light that came from nowhere. But still, the more time he looked at the slime drawing pictures in the sand, the more he realized that he really looked depressed, and told the hedgehog, who squeaked something in response. Ignoring his subsequent words that the slime looked more like poop, the hedgehog turned his head and saw an object off to the side that interested him. As he crawled toward the slime-melted dumbbell, reaching out for it with his paw, a depressed-looking slime turned and looked at him. Without thinking long, he began to build a logical chain based on the fact that a hedgehog is an animal. An animal is meat, and meat is the protein he needs. It was with poetry that he quickly and silently approached the unsuspecting hedgehog, immediately attacking it. When he heard a loud squeak from below, the boy opened his eyes wide and looked in the direction it came from. To his horror, there was this asshole slime clinging to the hedgehog's back, who clearly didn't want to let him go now. The hedgehog, in turn, unable to get up from the weight of the slime pressing down on him, realizing that he had not yet been killed, tried to crawl to the fallen cap. After getting used to his weight, realizing that he was in no danger, the hedgehog still decided to stand on his haunches and walk over to the cap, picking it up off the floor. Looking at him shaking it off as if nothing was happening, the engineer was perplexed, wondering if this depressed slime didn't have the strength to dissolve it. And then, quickly approaching them, slapped a finger on the forehead of the slime ball still hanging on the hedgehog's back, which caused him to stagger again. The system notified him that the slime was upset, and the slime in turn shuddered and cried at the bruise that appeared on its body. The guy in turn looked on in amazement as the depressed slime slowly slid off the hedgehog's body and back to the floor. Judging by his sad and angry sounds, the guy thought with disgust that the fact that he couldn't dissolve creatures anymore basically made him angry. Turning his head to the side in surprise, he noticed a hedgehog struggling to lift one of the bars, one of the few that was intact. Squatting down, he picked up one of the stones, thinking about the fact that this stone was actually much heavier than it looked at first glance. It was a slime, but still, whether it should turn him into a gym nut or not, he didn't understand. If he has indeed run out of acid and can't dissolve it, then his condition is understandable and it must be difficult. Meanwhile, in the guild room of the final boss, a gathering of guild members sat at a table in the middle of the room. Looking at them, the leader said that she had no luck contacting the leader after the beta ended, and something must have happened to him while he was in the game. Hyun-dakin suggested that it was probably all Astrum's doing. Charon, on the other hand, said she thought it was. Hugyeon, meanwhile, jumped up from her seat and slammed the table, asking what if they were wrong and if they were really talking about him being dead. Still, if it's not him, who else could use the nickname Raid Captain? This nickname has been used since the beta ended, and many others are available now. Dakin said she knew it was always like this, and Karen said she was right, because he didn't get an invitation from his friends or the guild. Taekwon in turn asked Yu Jong if she happened to make contact with the leader outside of the game world, and the game. After a bit of silence, she said that she had not been able to do it. Her coworker was doing it, and she had asked her recently. Taekwon replied that in that case, there are no options yet, so he suggested continuing to just look for leads. Then he asked if the rest of the guild members were online. The girl turned her head to the side and said that almost all but one of them were logged in. Ever since the guild name was changed, there's been problems and confusion. However, she insists Dakin and Charon will help them adjust, and she asks Brother Tak to focus on leveling up. Turning to Kong, she asked when the game's low season would start again. He smiled and decided to show off and said smugly that it was not low season but low season. He decided to correct it by repeating it in English with a Korean accent. Meanwhile, in the dungeon cave, the slime with a trembling body, being already completely in sweat, was lifting his lower body. The hedgehog standing over him as a trainer did not let him shirk his occupation and constantly squeaked something loudly. Looking at the state of the slime after all this, the guy wondered, what if this was the wrong way after all? Recovery should still take 5 minutes, although it is the 4th time, but still, the meltdown lasted 3 hours. But still, looking at this particular slime, he had seen absolutely no change in the entire time, as if it was all for nothing. The engineer thought if he made him train, he'd change for the better or something, but it's not that simple. It reminds him of the very time the Rat Cave case was solved in an abnormal and not particularly humane way. Suddenly, it was as if he was pierced by a realization. It was impossible for a slime ball to be obsessed with the gym after all. So this slug would know the answer anyway. Deciding that he should ask the slug after all, he called him over to him for a second, distracting him from his occupation and saving him from the hedgehog by doing so. After a while, the slime was beating its chest, trying something fiercely in its own language to tell the guy with tears in its eyes. Sitting across from him, the guy with a smarting look and shocked eyes tried to figure out what was going on, not understanding what the slime was telling him. As the slime told his story more and more in his own language, the boy's eyes grew wider and rounder with shock. All this time, he didn't understand what the man was even saying, or what he needed to know about it all. Putting his head down on his folded arms, the guy exhaled tiredly with the words that it would be really nice if someone would translate this nonsense to him. Hearing his words, the hedgehog immediately shone, thinking that this was his finest hour and a chance to help his friend. While the engineer was trying to figure out what hints he was giving him, Aik jumped off the seat he was sitting on with a squeak and headed for the slime. He ignored the hedgehog and slime wanting to explain something to him, still keeping his head down and talking about how there was no player around to help, and no swordsmen who could be good listeners. There wasn't even any information about the assignment or any explanation. The hedgehog was trying to draw attention to himself, wanting him to look at him. Though he needed to use everything he had in there, still, both monsters were no help at all. As if realizing something, he immediately smiled happily and raised his head, now looking at the slime. The hedgehog lying on the floor, already desperate for something to explain to him, looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he wanted. Meanwhile, the engineer had already snatched his sword from its sheath, standing directly in front of the slime, with words that he finally understood. It didn't mean he'd lose without finding a solution. The hedgehog meanwhile exhaled and turned his head to the side, not really trusting what the guy wanted to do. A few minutes later, the guy was already easily dealing with all the remaining slimes, cutting them apart with the fire skill on his sword. After shredding the last remaining slimes, he walked over to where there were now 2 puddles instead, and 2 green pebbles. Walking over to them, he began to pick them up in his hand, already counting over 100 pieces and immediately saying it was a great move to start collecting them early. Turning to the hedgehog, he cheerfully said that, so this slug was actually quite useful, and asked if he disagreed with him. Meanwhile, he squeaked something to the slime, which immediately said something sadly in response. Having understood what he wanted, the hedgehog began to describe it all in colors to the guy, accompanying the whole story with gestures. As if understanding his language, the engineer said that perhaps he wanted him to make a corrosion-resistant dumbbell. Then he said that if that was the case, it would be very easy. The next instant, the lad was down on his knee and eagerly shook the hedgehog's paw, saying that he had just had a great idea. Looking at the one as the slug crawled up to him and started to show him something, the guy asked what the guy was asking him to do, and then said that, anyway, he'd be done soon. He took out an axe and 100 glowing green stones from his inventory, preparing to synthesize it all into something one. Activating his skills, the guy said with a smile that for their information, you need to possess at least 1 forging skill in RPG games. The hedgehog and the slime didn't respond anything to his words, looking mesmerized at the whole process of this magic. Having melted all the stones in his hand, he turned it over and said that everything was just fine, and now he would put the molten crystal into the axe. Raising the axe up again, one could see that instead of continuing to glow red, it began to recolor into a yellow light. With a snap of his fingers, he activated a blue light between them with smug words that this whole thing he was doing was just crazy. Slime, meanwhile, was watching him closely, not wanting to miss anything. Meanwhile, the player was already finishing the formation of his hammer, which began to light up with bright colors, blues, reds, and yellows. Slime continued to stare at all of this, still not realizing how all of this would eventually lead to him finally being able to get pumped up. After a while, the guy held out a hammer in his direction and said loudly that it was a special weapon of the gym weirdo or a dumbbell. Slime looked at the bright light in front of him with tears in his eyes, realizing that this guy was helping him out a lot right now. And the guy said with a smile, what with that, now the slime should definitely try to pump himself up, and he'll definitely succeed. The depressed slime reached out his hands and gleefully touched the glowing bright white light, a huge axe in the guy's hands. With the ability to corrode everything with just his touch, he became sad because he couldn't bench press weights. He liked to exercise, but he was afraid to touch the barbell or dumbbells lest he ruin them. The guy looking at him couldn't stop smiling. To the slime, he was now literally a benefactor. The hedgehog looked admiringly at the picture in front of him. He hadn't originally thought it would be just like this. In front of them stood the now swaying slime, with a huge back, narrow waist, and pumped shoulders and arms. Kneeling down in front of the guy and placing the axe in front of him, the slime thought about the fact that the slug would be loyal to him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the game developer covered his eyes and tried to figure out why this girl was writing to him all the time. However, he did decide to open a message asking why there was still no contact and what this training video was all about in the first place. The system reads a message that he can see his health status by opening the attachments. If the condition is not critical, regular reports can be delivered every week, so let him keep that in mind. Looking at the cave, the boy said perplexedly that he would never have thought that she would run like that. As he entered the place with his weapon at the ready, he looked around trying to figure out where to go. Turning his head, he noticed the entrance and pronounced that there were no monster recovery problems fixed in that part. But still, why he couldn't recover images of battles he didn't understand. Remembering the state the development team was in and how many times the bug had been brought up, the guy wondered. Perhaps it was all feedback from the artificial intelligence, but it was all kind of weird. He was definitely sure there was some kind of mistake in it. As he walked further, he saw a cave whose ceiling had collapsed, and the whole place was strewn with stones. While he was thinking about what the hell this was all about, a system window appeared right in front of him and notified him that due to a server update, his access inside was denied. The engineer shook his head with a smile, asking if that was it, and if there was really nothing more to be done. Slime, in turn, scratched his head in surprise and awkwardness, not understanding what else he had to do or what the guy meant. In the next instant, he, who had not expected any trick, was so quickly cut into pieces by some sharp object that he did not even have time to realize what had happened. Meanwhile, in the newcomers' village, the newly arrived team was trying to figure out where they should go. There had been a lot more people since they'd been gone, after all. The kid who still hadn't found clothes said that was right. This place was located according to the coordinates on the guild's bulletin board. It said that the last guild was located in front of the fountain in the village square. At that moment, they heard some sounds from outside. They turned in that direction, where a man pronounced that he was glad to meet them. As he approached them, the fat man tucked his hair back on his forehead and haughtily said that this was exactly what was expected of his experienced subordinates, and he was very pleased. Noticing him and the way he was talking, the faces of all the people standing there immediately crinkled. They didn't expect to see him at all. Seemingly not noticing the awkward atmosphere that had been created, the guy held out his sword towards the man in front of him and said that when he saw the master, he should greet him respectfully. The one in turn slapped the sword with his hand, drawing its blade away from him, and asked angrily what was wrong with this man with an 8th grader's syndrome. Grabbing him by the collar, he quickly approached him and asked if this guy was such a chump that he wanted to die. In the dungeon cave, meanwhile, all the chopped up parts of the slime piled up on the floor, and in the darkness behind him appeared some huge beetle jaws covered with a sharp blade. It had obviously cut the slime into pieces with it. After a moment, the beetle finally came into view, fully grown in all its glory. The huge mantis, if the system was to be believed, called the cave, nicknamed the Barren Cave. After looking around, the beetle turned his attention to the guy standing in the distance and watching everything that was going on, who didn't even expect it to be like this. When he realized that this mantis was about to rush towards him, he opened his eyes wide in shock, unable to say a word. At the same moment, Mantis was quickly grabbed by the neck with a huge hand by Slime, robbing him of the ability to move, quickly recovering from what had happened to him. Quickly jumping to his feet, he threw the mantis against the ground with force, not giving it any time to respawn. The fact that the slime didn't die from being chopped to pieces was due to regeneration. This slime will continue to regenerate until someone pierces its core. With his other hand, Slime picked up the axe hammer that had fallen from his grasp and hurled the monster away from him. The mantis dodged the blow in time to dodge it on the floor. The mantis, however, dodged the blow in time. Looking at the monster with one eye while the other recovered, the slime said something loudly in its own language. After listening to him, the monster didn't waste any time and began to strike the slime quickly. Slime, in turn, found himself once again slashed by the sharp blades, unable to resist the mantis in any way. He thought back to the times when he and the other slimes had been terrorized by that mantis, forced to live in a starker from him. Then he was weak and depressed and could not resist him in any way, from which he hid behind the backs of his kin, who were just as afraid of him. The memory of it made him grip the axe in his hands even tighter and more tightly. Looking at all this, the guy ignoring the hedgehog mesmerized by the fight scene, thought about why the description suddenly appeared. Above the praying mantis that stood aside now licking bloodily, his name glowed, a mantis that had lost its friends. Meanwhile, the slime began to quickly unwind the axe in his hands, preparing to attack the mantis. The mantis didn't wait any longer and attacked the slime with its jaws, and the slime in turn stopped spinning its axe and swung it towards the mantis. Even the fact that the mantis pierced his torso with one of their claws did not stop the slime. With a sorrowful expression on his face, he continued to hover at the mantis. Looking at them, the guy said with his arms folded across his chest that this gym fan apparently does this a lot, and maybe it would be best to watch him for a while. Mantis seemed to be smiling, more and more anticipating his easy victory over the slime, who didn't fight back much. With a trembling claw, the mantis slowly cut the very skull responsible for regeneration from the slime's body. In the next instant, the slime finally came to his senses, grabbed the monster's claw with his teeth, kicked the other away with one paw, and took it by the throat with the other, lifting it above him. Wrenching its claw from its grasp, the mantis tried to swing at the slime again, hoping to catch it. However, the slime, in turn, quickly dodged the incoming blow. This time he was playing for real. Quickly dropping him to the ground, the slime slapped his muzzle with force and began to twist his head from his neck. In one swift motion, ripping it off and hurling the rest of the monster's body far away into the stone wall of the cave. The guy immediately clapped his hands, watching the resulting explosion as the mantis's body collided with the cave wall. Meanwhile, in the rookie village, the newly arrived players of their beta test team were lying helplessly on the ground. The fat man standing over them haughtily pulled his hair back and then said, If they underestimate someone, let them mean they'll pay for it anyway. And that's what people usually say. The guy looking at him suddenly felt some very familiar sense of déjà vu. Above this guy's name was Song Su, and his name was 21. He was really like a raid captain. Of course, he effortlessly defeated the guys without equipment who were only level 5. Meanwhile, the unclothed kid shouted that in that case, he would go along with everything until they met the real guild master. Everyone else quickly changed their minds and said that although he was a little annoying, he was cool. And the fact that he's a little crazy won't be a problem for them. Walking up to them, the fatty held out his hand and asked pathetically what it meant that they had now suddenly decided to finally become his comrades. Meanwhile, in the dungeon cave, the hedgehog stared in amazement at the few red stones that had fallen out of the mantis's body. He remembered the guy telling him as he sat on his shoulder that if he wanted something, he could go and eat it all. Deciding not to ask again, the hedgehog immediately began gnawing on these red pebbles with his front teeth. Even though he was very hungry, Yedek still, even so, felt the simply divine flavor of these pebbles. In the meantime, some purple, upsetting mucus began to come out of the mantis's body through its mouth. Looking up, she immediately spotted her first victim in the distance, a hedgehog who unsuspectingly was quietly gnawing on his pebbles. Noticing that the hedgehog hadn't paid attention to her, the slime wasted no time in rushing towards him, ready to jump and melt him. At that moment, the hedgehog turned around and, opening its mouth, directed a jet of flame directly at that slime, thus completely burning it to the ground. Even for the hedgehog himself, it all happened so unexpectedly that he remained sitting with his mouth open, trying to realize what had just happened. Meanwhile, the guild leader was sitting on a chair, and with an incomprehensible expression on her face, expressing both surprise and anger and disgust, was staring intently at the monitor in front of her. She clicked her mouse and mopped up the news on Astrom's official portal, where there was much discussion. Of these, the most popular topics were whether it is true that the raid captain is missing, what the situation was with the gathering online without a leader, and who finally used the nickname Raid Captain. After a brief thought, she opened the question about whether or not it was true that the raid captain was missing in action. Besides, about the nickname of the raid captain, he knows some rumors. She clicked on the question, thinking it was just nonsense, especially since it said he was drawing attention to himself that way. After reading everything that was written there, the girl let the mouse out of her hands and pounded her fist on the table with force, calling them freaks and saying that she would sue them. She clicked on the profile of the user who had written all this and said she should probably get his nickname. However, instead, another post popped up for her saying that it's all a fallacy, and really it's all about just everyone watching his video 100 times, and he really hopes the leader is doing well in the Astros. Underneath this entire post, which invited all guild fans at the end, was the signature of the very same Song Su, as well as a picture of him. The girl, shocked, opened her mouth wide, intending to digest the information she had just read. And then, the place of tedium gave way to anger, and she shouted loudly that this was the same dwarf who had refused to sell her the guild. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, the engineer was clapping the slime with a smile, telling him that it was all just marvelous. The hedgehog, standing next to him, looked at the painting in front of him with the same admiration, but apparently he had no words. The slime, standing in front of them, scratched his head with a silly look, unsure of how to actually react to their reactions and praise towards him. Deciding to break the tense silence, the guy asked him with a smile, wondering if this was his usual size. To the hedgehog's surprise, the slime shook his head slightly, as if to say with that this wasn't all of his usual form yet. Walking on, he stared at the killed bug, with the words that they had dropped the whole thing, and he was sure that this way, they would definitely be able to kill it. The guy picked up one of the objects from the stone floor, which the system immediately dubbed as a mantis knife. And then, ignoring the slime that had started swinging again, and the hedgehog that was practicing, the guy said that he didn't think things would work out like this. After finally collecting all the items and looking at their characteristics, the engineer turned towards the monsters and shouted to them that everything was ready. Both the slime and the hedgehog stared in surprise at the guy approaching them, thus distracting themselves from their studies. Looking at the way they stood in a string, the guy started talking about being called or attacked or attacking first. That was the whole question. Kneeling down in front of the hedgehog, the boy stared at it with thoughts of how everything in this world has order. Patting him on the arm, he divined that he wanted to give him a new name first. When he heard him say something in agreement, the engineer explained that by getting a new name, he was losing his old name. He asked if he agreed with that. Looking at him faithfully, the hedgehog first thoughtfully and then confidently said something in his own language, as if he agreed with him. The guy patted him on the head again, saying that in that case it was good. And then he said that from now on, he would call him Kwang Kwang. The hedgehog said something shocked and confused. The head of the raid had given him the same name as the last one. Without realizing what he was saying, the engineer rose to his feet and suggested that the mission was now finally over. And then he turned toward the slime that had begun to sway again, and then addressed him confidently, drawing attention to himself. When he turned in his direction, he told him to stop finally shaking his weight and come closer to him. Rubbing the slime down on one knee, the guy said that since he was a gym-obsessed slime, they would now call him Jock Slime. A new name immediately popped up above the satisfied slime's head. His name was now Kachko Slime, and he liked his new name. The system immediately notified him that the mission was complete, and also in addition to him, side missions have been completed, and an additional mission has been added. And he cannot reject this mission. At the same time, she also informed him that if he doesn't complete the mission, he will be punished twice. Therefore, he needs to make sure that Kachko Slime defeats the dungeon boss. And also about the fact that at the moment there is no one stronger than Kacho Slime, and he wants to become as strong as the engineer. And the system told the guy to train the strongest slime in the dungeon. The guy in turn turned back and said that it shouldn't be that easy, and that it was somehow too obvious. He smiled again and said that if it were the boss or anyone else, they would have just killed them all long ago. The hedgehog in turn answered nothing, not even seeming to listen to anything he said, busy trying to take a bite out of something in his paws. Suddenly, some kind of explosion behind him caused the ground to crack and the ceiling to collapse in some places. Judging by what the system wrote, the monster that appeared so suddenly was simply an armed skeleton. Pulling his sword out of its sheath, the engineer thought about the feeling he had that this mob was somehow more powerful and stronger than the previous mobs. That's why, looking at the way he was swinging at him, the guy thought about the fact that in a case like this, he couldn't let his guard down right now. Taking the sword tighter with both hands, he swung with force, heading towards the skeleton with great speed. The skeleton tried to do something and resist the guy, but he was faster, and in one move he cut the monster in two. And then smiled and said that it was just because he didn't want to waste good potions on trifles like him. Looking at him laughing and praising himself, the hedgehog turned away and shook his head as if to condemn him for such ugly behavior. At that moment, a slime appeared next to the guy, to which he immediately turned his attention. This slime never stopped swinging at breakneck speed without being distracted by anything, and with all that, it looked very happy. The guy watching him immediately lost all his good mood, thinking that he was really sick of this, and would all this really be useful in the game? Nevertheless, he still turned to Kachko Slime and told him to at least try to open the status window. He gurgled something in agreement. What he saw on the status window table made the engineer stiffen in shock, unable to say anything. In his opinion, it was just crazy, although the slime's intelligence was at 30, but still the main characteristics of strength reached as high as 420, and in such a short amount of time. Without looking at the skulls scattered around the cave, the guy said that he had done a little bit, and whether everything really turned out that way in the end. Meanwhile, in the real world, the two guild girls were quietly shopping and having fun at the mall after a long day of work. Dakin turned to Charon and asked if she thought that Yujon had been acting a little too strange lately. She, in turn, without even turning back, replied that it was indeed so, and she too had noticed it all recently. Dakin said that when they walked into Astrum, she was a little confused, like she was preparing for something. Charon turned around and said that of course she was preparing. She was a perfectionist after all. Dakin didn't like that answer, and said that was why it was strange. The fact that they'd suddenly moved to Astrum right before a large-scale raid made her very suspicious. Charon averted her eyes and asked her to think. Then she said that the leader's brother had told them not to be late with all this. She remembered him talking about how there was going to be a major raid in Row Online, and the Boo Gilma would beat him if he never showed up. After listening to her, Dakin said doubtfully that there was definitely something going on. Both Row Online and Astrum, the Guildmaster and Choi Yu-jong, were definitely involved. Suddenly, Charon stared at her phone in shock, reading a recent notification she had received in the guild chat, and then held out her phone to Dakin, showing her a message from the general chat about the urgent gathering that Yu-jong had called them all to. Meanwhile, in the Astrum Developers Building, one of the developers' computers finally popped up the long-awaited notification that the quest had begun. One of the developers sitting in front of the computer couldn't even believe his eyes when he finally saw this notification. But the next thing you know, all the developers there jumped up and down, and that developer shouted that it was a crazy jackpot, and today they would eat Korean beef stew. One of the developers did not rejoice with the others, but reflected on the fact that the Quest Guild has joined more than 1 million users, and now the quest is released. The next instant, a sly smile appeared on his face, and he thought that they were simply excellent at using other people's labor and strength. Grabbing his phone, he began to quickly type a message into it. thinking about the fact that they were afloat thanks to the raid captain, and he just had to tell the explorer about his success. In the meantime, the explorer wandered the caverns of the dungeon without encountering monsters, but was getting terribly tired. Looking around at the scattered bones, he said that the level of molten skeleton was 48th, and the acid slime level was 55. Until yesterday, the average level among users was 19, and the highest level, 38th. What happened in the dungeon was just crazy in his opinion. This guy was a real leader, but then what his mission wasn't clear. Oh, and the fact that all those monsters were killed and mopped up by this one guy was a mismic, and he was incredibly powerful. At that moment, a system notification popped up in front of the guy, where one of the developers was writing to him saying that they had reached 1 million downloads, and he's planning to have Korean beef dinner tonight, and he's inviting him over too. Reading what was written there at the end, it said that the guild quest had started and the boss wanted him to participate in it. The boy's face darkened. He didn't know if his boss was serious about assigning him. People like to prank their coworkers these days. Without thinking long, he closed the message and opened the guild quest notification, deciding to decide what the guild quest even was. The system brought up the information that they are looking for outstanding warriors in the Kingdom of Arthur. There will be a martial arts competition that all qualified Astromians can participate in. Reading what was written there, the guy jumped up from his seat in shock, bewildered, asking where the martial arts competition was coming from. However, he knew for a fact that this guy, the raid captain, was pretty tough, so maybe he would definitely be fine. Suddenly, a terrible voice came from the depths of the cave, asking him who he was. The explorer, in turn, turned quickly, noticing eyes glowing with icy blue light in the darkness of the cave. Then, stammering, he asked if he was the head of the raid. The voice growled loudly, slowly moving closer to him, and then asked who he was, and why he was looking for him in this place in the first place. At the entrance to the boss's lair, the engineer left the hedgehog waiting for him, telling him to wait there and not to go anywhere. Then he handed him a homemade knife, telling him to use it to play with the slime if he got bored. The hedgehog, for his part, glowed. Turning towards the slime, he told it to stop swinging at last and go hunting in this dungeon. After telling them everything he wanted, the guy headed deep into the dark cavern that was in the dungeon, while activating the guildmaster's special skill, Ice Aura. And after activating the Ice Aura, he began to activate the Claw Aura skill, which began to form from that aura, the sharpest claws on his hand. Breaking from his seat and rushing into the depths, he shouted that he who attacks first wins. Immediately, he swung around with force and struck with his claws, cutting through the entire stone floor in front of him with them. Moments later, his fervor waned as he realized he hadn't reached his enemy and slashed his knife straight at the hollow stone. Stopping in the middle of the cave, he looked around, wanting to spot anything or anyone in that place. Having found nothing in this place, the guy thoughtfully muttered that this was actually some kind of big disappointment. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet trembled, and he quickly bounced from where he stood, darting into another part of the cave. Then he quickly drew his sword from its sheath, using the aura shifting skill, which was used to move active auras at high speed. The guy noticed that the floor had abruptly stopped shaking, and it made him even more tense and made him look around, hoping to figure out what was wrong and what was going on. Turning his head the other way, he suddenly noticed something falling out of the ceiling of the cave, brown in color and simply gigantic in size. Judging from its size and color, it was some kind of overgrown worm, and also, from the looks of it, it was the dungeon boss. Looking at the one collecting poisonous slime in his mouth to attack him with it, the guy thought about how disgusting this dungeon was. And then, already having a plan in my head to destroy this worm, I rushed straight at him, parallelly pulling my sword out of its sheath. Quickly dodging the attack that flew in his direction, the engineer ran forward towards the worm without stopping. The worm himself stood calmly in his place and did not seem to notice the hostile guy approaching him at all. And the guy, in turn, began to activate the skill on the sword and pulling it out of its sheath with the words that now he will be very hurt. Then, without wasting any more time, he pulled it out, and the blade covered in some kind of ice finally fully revealed itself to the light. Striking a few quick blows, he activated the basic test skill punch. The user handled the weapon quickly and confidently and summons a blast. Hearing some sounds from the cave in front of him, the boy stopped in surprise and lowered his sword. He hadn't expected that someone could still be living in this deep and dark abyss. The sounds were either muffled moans or harsh screams. The boy felt a chill go down his spine. He didn't understand why he was finally hearing sounds from there. The engineer quickly bounced away from where he was standing, deciding not to push his luck and see who was there first. Hearing the ceiling crack, the guy tensely raised his head looking up at it, expecting to see anything there. Up there, first the huge jaws with giant teeth of some reptile appeared, clearly displeased with the intrusion. And then, right in front of them, appeared a huge crocodile-like reptile, which was called, judging by what the system showed, the master of the barren cave. Hedgehog and Slime stopped and looked at him in surprise, not understanding where the crocodile had come from. The crocodile, meanwhile, stared intently at the creatures in front of him, as if not knowing what to do in the end either. Looking directly into his eyes, the hedgehog began to slowly build a logical chain. First, the captain of the raid went inside, then the entrance was closed by huge jaws. And then it turned out that it was actually a crocodile. The next guess struck the hedgehog. He couldn't believe that maybe it all meant that the leader had been eaten. But it was scary to even think about it. Noticing a strange light in the distance, the slime slowly looked in the direction it was coming from. The prickles on the hedgehog's back, meanwhile, began to burn brightly, and he stood on his four legs with a menacing squeak. Slime covered his eyes against the bright fire in incomprehension, feeling the unstoppable heat emanating from it. The hedgehog, meanwhile, stood up on two legs, and with burning eyes began to squeak something loudly in the direction of the crocodile, who did nothing against them. Kwong hurled a fireball towards the crocodile, activating Kwong's special skill that he used to spit out fireballs. By then, the guy had approached the monster from behind, and once again applied the Aura Riot skill, with which the aura was dispersed everywhere, and cutting the monster apart with his sword. The monster immediately dropped dead, unable to resist such attacks. The guy in turn quickly jumped back from where he was before, and then jumped to the floor and stopped while thrusting his sword into the stone floor in front of him. Hearing the explosion that resulted from the guy jumping off, the monsters immediately turned back. The hedgehog immediately happily turned on him and started squeaking, heading towards him. The engineer, in turn, covered in blood that didn't belong to him, began to repeat after him with a smile and beeped in the same way. Looking at him flying toward him, the boy happily opened his arms wide, preparing to catch him in his arms. When he hugged it, he immediately thought it was very hot, so much so that it burned his hands and fingers, which made him immediately let it out of his hands. Slime decided not to approach and just sat down next to him, looking at the guy and the hedgehog standing in front of him with a smile. After a while, some creature became visible in the darkness of the cave, growling menacingly at something. Looking at him, the developer frightenedly fell to the floor, asking in a trembling voice if he happened to be the raid captain. Right in front of him stood three huge, terrifying monsters, making him shiver in terror and not understanding who they were. Meanwhile, the engineer stared back at him in surprise, not realizing if he was a player or just another mob from the system. As he came closer to him, he knelt down and asked in a friendly manner if he was a researcher from the company that developed Astrum. Frowning, the guy asked in a rougher tone what he was even doing there in the game, and grabbing him by his clothes shouted, asking what the hell was going on in their damn game. The one who was asked did not see him as a man and could not understand what he wanted from him, so he asked with a hesitation if he was really a leader. Not realizing that he was there yelling at him and what he wanted from him, the developer tried to manage his trepidation and asked if he was asking what was going on. The guy, meanwhile, kept holding him by the collar with words to go after him. Suddenly, there was a system message saying that he was automatically moved since the mission was completed. He will be given a new mission and role. The hedgehog, meanwhile, began to disappear rapidly and as if dissolving into thin air, being transported to another place. The guy yelled damn loudly, not expecting such a setup from the system and the fact that it would complete his mission so quickly. The developer, meanwhile, slumped to the floor, listening to the guy as he disappeared, shouting to him that he hoped they would meet outside after all. In the meantime, the system displayed a notification for him that they are rebooting the system in the dungeon due to a system error. For the safety of the user, the system will be forced to shut down after 30 seconds. Looking at it and reading what it said, the guy thought it was definitely a raid captain, considering the system deduced an error. He thought about the fact that since the beta ended, there had not been a single problem in the program, and that's the only way to find a leader. When he stopped thinking about it, the guy lifted his head, startled to see a huge jockstrap across from him, not realizing what the hell it was. Slime, in turn, looked at him the same way, not understanding who he was and what Slime needed to do with him. Walking forward on the road ahead, the guy sparsely kicked a rock while loudly swearing. He was already just annoyed with the whole damn game, which was like wanting to make more trouble for him. Without looking at the stopped hedgehog, he said that this always happens when he's about to solve a problem. The next moment, the mission reward chest sent by the system fell right in front of them, but the engineer wasn't even happy about it, kicking it with force and thus accidentally opening it. However, he didn't care, because that shit doesn't help either. The system notified him that the mission was forcibly canceled because it was not reviewed in time, and the reward will be increased if the joint mission is successfully completed. The guy quickly turned in her direction and started punching through the screen, yelling loudly that he couldn't even hit it. And it's so infuriating that he's going to lose his mind at this rate. Sitting down on the chest in front of him, he lowered his head tiredly, unsure of what to do or how to leave this game. At this point, the system again displayed a notification that new conditions would now be created for the next task. Now an army management has been created for him. This is a special condition for highly ranked NPS. Reading what it said that only when he had been trained would he be able to turn on the function, he thought it wasn't just that there were no results. Judging by the fact that the researcher is immersed in the game, there's no problem with his body in reality, and he's sure he's here to figure out what's going on. Apparently, he's not being released for a specific reason, though he doesn't know why, but he's pretty sure Astrum needs him. Those two mentioned that Astrum is a game where artificial intelligence bases gameplay on getting data. Then it turns out they're going to fill in the underperforming data in the game with just him. First, the missions were very different from those quests, which were different from normal quests. It's not quests, but missions, and if the point is that it can directly affect the game, then it makes sense. Besides, anyone can get quests, but only he is given missions. The next guess made him jump up from where he was sitting. Perhaps the whole thing was that Astrum was not yet complete. It is the end of the game, and will be the moment of the Astrum's completion, and the moment when he can finally leave the game. The knights and the mage, meanwhile, were moving quietly on horseback through the forest, heading towards the lad. Quickly dropping to a knee as they approached the guy, they greeted him loudly, saying welcome. Noticing them only when they approached and shouted a greeting to him, he quickly turned on them. He immediately recognized them as they approached him with glittering eyes, looking at him and calling him Raid Captain. Sitting back down in his seat, he asked how he was doing and who had come with them. One of the soldiers held out his hand and pointed to the Mago with the words that this was now their colleague, added for the mission. He said a quick hello and said that he had recently been assigned to a border protection mission. Then he asked me to take care of him. The guy looked at him in surprise, questioning what the hell this border security was all about. The system immediately displayed a notification that a new mission had been created to protect the borders of Arthur's kingdom and MZ its goals to accomplish 3 hidden missions. The guy turned toward the window in shock, asking what the fuck because he absolutely did not open the errand window because he wanted to rest. Standing up, he began to warm up. Now being swamped with work added to his problems, but he still wondered if he was starting this. And then he turned toward the mage, saying that it might be worth it to see what he could be useful for. The system displayed a notification that he was level 30 and his loyalty was at level 50. The engineer thought that wasn't so bad. He had the same stats as the swordsman before they left. Turning back to the soldiers, he decided to check on their progress. From what the system was showing, and the level, popularity, and intimacy of the guys had risen since they'd broken up. Looking at their data, the guy smiled happily, and he couldn't help but be pleased, from which he immediately praised them, saying that they had done a very good job. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, the improved, depressed Slime easily cut his opponent in two with a huge axe. At that moment, something that looked like jewelry or something valuable fell to the floor from an unknown source. And also on top of that, a diary or book fell down. Suddenly, the Slime heard from outside, as the engineer called out to him, calling him Kachko Slime, and asked if he could hear him. Turning his head to the side, he saw the rock from which the voice was heard. He repeated it again, asking if he could hear it. The hedgehog also uttered something similar. Not paying attention to what he said, the guy said that he would call him soon, so let him not play and level up. And then he warned that even if he didn't answer, the guy wouldn't understand him. So he understands, and it's okay if he keeps quiet. So he asks you to take care of the runestone and wishes you good luck. After the guy stopped talking, the stone stopped hanging in the air and fell to the ground, still glowing. Slime immediately squatted down and reached for a rock lying on the ground with a clearly noticeable effort. Taking it in his hands, he exhaled in relief, as if picking it up off the ground had cost him a lot of strength, and then sparingly hid it in the folds of his torso, hoping to preserve it that way. Slime turned his head to the side, seeing a journal of notes and equipment in the form of a sword and shield lying on the stone floor. This magazine, judging by the cover, was a report on the beta test of Captain Raid, and a report on a bug that occurred in that beta test. The guy looked at the stone in his hands. From what the system wrote, it was a calling rune stone that could be used as a portable walkie-talkie at any time. After reading everything the system had written about it, he said that it seemed to have many functions, so he should give it to the swordsman and Kwang Kwang too. Finished with the Kaznem, he squatted down in front of the box again, looking inside it with anticipation. And then he was given the Soul Collector's necklace, which apparently he'd already gotten once in his reward chest. The guy looked at him in surprise, not understanding why there was once again a Soul Collector caught there, or if there really was a whole set. Putting the necklace around his neck, he thought about the fact that it actually appeared to be some sort of height or even a set. Smiling like a maniac who goes crazy for gaming stuff and objects, the guy thought this was pretty damn cool. The hedgehog, clearly disapproving of his behavior, shook his head, remembering how he had treated that reward chest from the beginning. That one, meanwhile, decided to check out the Soul Collector earrings as well, which were a growth-type item. Looking at the system window, the guy thought he'd caught about 2,000 in the Kachko slime lair, and the situation with the necklace was the same as with the earrings. At that moment, the two soldiers approached the boy and called out to him, distracting him from his musings. One of them handed the surprised boy some kind of cloak and said that from now on he must wear it. The second soldier handed the cloak to the hedgehog, who began to jump and squeak with joy. In reply to the guy's surprised question about why he needed the cloak, the soldier replied that from now on he would have to hide his identity. He asked once more, putting on his robe if he had to hide himself. The soldier nodded and went into his cloak, and then handed him a paper saying that it was, and what he's showing him is actually the king's decree. Judging by the crown-like seal on the decree, the guy realized that it was indeed a royal decree. Taking it from the hands of a soldier who said he didn't get it directly, the engineer thought there must be a mission there. The soldier, meanwhile, cheerfully said that the royal seal was real, and their majesty must have recognized his ability. Not listening to his chatter, he hurriedly broke the seal of the decree and unfolded it. It was written there that it was an appeal to the raid captain and the commander of the Polar Bear Knights. They are waiting for him in the border village, so have them stop by his place as soon as possible before the Michia begins. The boy stared in surprise at what was written there next. He knew for sure that it was actually their secret. Opposite the people in cloaks stood a huge monster that looked like it was a fiend from hell, and behind it there were several more of the same monsters. The magician girl asked the guy to wait, saying that it was not there. And activating the magic cane, she continued, saying that she had never seen such monsters before. The engineer, in turn, did not listen to her, and walked forward asking what it means that they were attracted there by the cracks in the wall. The magician quickly replied that it looked like that. Looking at them approaching him, the monster growled something loudly, angry at them even more than before. Suddenly, a huge hand appeared out of nowhere and grabbed the monster across the body and lifted it into the air. Feeling that his air was being cut off and he was slowly beginning to die, unable to do anything, the monster began to growl loudly and protractedly. After some time, the magician said that after studying the traces on the border, she could say that before that she had not encountered such a skill. And that DJ TM's why she had such a bad assumption that this was all actually connected with black magic. The monster opposite them, still held by a huge purple hand, opened its mouth and began to release some strange black substance from it. This unknown black substance somehow began to affect the girl Dajtam's magic. Under the influence of the substance penetrating inside, the magic began to crack and collapse as if it were made of the thinnest glass. Meanwhile, the guy took out a sword, and with great speed headed towards the monsters, saying what this means. They were the guys who made a gap in the border. And then he quickly approached the monster and pierced his heart before he could do anything. Looking at the monster falling dead, not paying attention to the hedgehog sitting on its back, inspired by the battle, the guy thought that the difficulty of the mission was gaining momentum, just when he finally wanted to relax. Meanwhile, in the game forest, the players who had arrived there were arguing about whether joining the guild was a good decision and whether they were even okay to stay. The dwarf, looking deep into the forest, confidently told them all not to worry. However, from his facial expression, one could understand that it was worth worrying. At that moment, a fat guy jumped out of the forest, running from the rats, and shouting in response to the words that everything would go well, that it was actually not so simple. The dwarf, in turn, tiredly put his hand to his forehead, listening to the fat man Vijaya Tam's warnings and his words that they should be more careful in any case. And then he angrily shouted that this was his first battle after choosing a new role, and first of all, they must catch 3 aggro mobs. One of the guys with a huge shield quickly went around one of the monsters and stood in front of him, not allowing him to move to the side or escape. At this moment, the other 2 monsters immediately rushed at him from the other side, intending to take him by surprise and defeat him. However, the guy immediately threw them away from him with his shield, not allowing them to get to him, shouting for them to go to hell. Grimacing, he tensely said with surprise that in fact all this was much more painful than he had thought before. The other players who were trying to fight off the monsters shouted that they were so strong, perhaps because their level was higher than it seemed at first glance. And the dwarf shouted to the archer that in this case, she should shoot one at a time. Fatty, meanwhile, noticing that the monsters were distracted from him, quickly rushed towards the forest. And then, having reached its beginning, He turned around and stopped, saying with a smile that they could easily catch 3. Running closer, the guy easily activated the basic sword skill, a slash, and raised his sword over the monsters. Then he jumped up, using the jumping technique and using his own weight in an attack that increases damage due to weight, and dealt a crushing blow to the place where the monsters were. In the resulting fog of dust and dirt, the guy turned around and drew attention to the monster running towards him, who seemed to think that he was invisible. And then, without looking at the monsters, he pathetically told them to look at themselves and the fact that they were now coming to him. Having hit him on the forehead of the approaching monster, the guy shouted that this was all a super crack from the guild master. The guy looked at the flying monster with an impudent smile and smugly thought that he was just fucking cool. Meanwhile, the engineer happily said that he had finally finished everything and completed the preparations, and the hedgehog, in turn, immediately said something. Hearing him tell them to open the portal, the magician in the hat nodded his head lightly and began to open the portal, holding out a magic stick forward. They finally teleported to the huge, fortified walls of the capital, where all this time life had not ceased to boil. The guy raised his head, looking up into the sides, and then said tensely that this was all just a huge fortress. Meanwhile, the approaching soldiers said with a smile that all this was indeed so. Since there is a border there is no choice, and high walls have to be built. The engineer walked up to the wall and knocked on it with the back of his fist, saying that the stone in the wall should be large and heavy. The soldiers, in turn, said that the stone was really large and heavy, which was ideal for strength training. And the workers who built the walls had a bitsuka as thick as a rib. The engineer turned to them with a smile and asked if they actually knew that they had come there to do exactly the same thing. His words made both soldiers fall silent and frozen in one position in shock, unable to do anything else. The hedgehog sitting on his back also froze in shock, realizing what this all meant and what would actually follow. Meanwhile, the guy turned to the soldiers with the words that he would give them a task, and they would have to accept it. They, in turn, hysterically asked if he was serious about this, while he laughed evilly from the faces of the soldiers who read the assignment, where it was written that it was tedious to hire workers to repair the walls. Because the cracks on the walls, the strength of which the residents of the border village are proud of, are bothering the villagers. After laughing, the guy said with a smile that he was just joking and they couldn't relax. Still, when they hire workers, they will immediately fix everything. Turning around, he waved his hand and told them to relax anyway. The soldiers said that they understood and asked where he was going. He responded by pointing to the wall, where a crack was visible at a height, and said that such a dent would not have appeared just like that. Besides, that's why he's going to go with this guy, the magician. Perhaps together with him, they will eventually learn something. In turn, the magician took hold of his magic staff more tightly, not saying anything in response, but being wary of what he heard. After some time, looking out of the corner of his eye at the magician, the guy thought that since his closeness with the soldiers had become so high, now he should completely focus on this guy. Turning to the magician, he immediately asked if he had ever been to the border village. The magician, who jumped in surprise, replied that this was his first time. The engineer turned back and said that everything turned out to be true, but he did not look surprised when he saw the wall. That's why the guy decided that he had simply seen her before. The magician, in turn, remembered something and said that when he studied at the School of Magic, they often used magic to look at the border. The guy, hearing him, stopped and said that he understood everything, and then asked how long he had studied there. The magician thoughtfully replied that about 10 years, and now for the first time, he came out of school into the big world. He quickly turned and approached the magician, and unexpectedly, in one easy movement, took off his hat, revealing his face. Frowning, still holding the hat in his hands, he angrily asked who he really was. The magician immediately snatched the hat from his hands, asking what he was talking about. The system, in turn, notified the guy that the magician felt uncomfortable, and also the proximity decreased by 5 units. Pulling the sword out of its sheath, the guy asked if he really wanted to say that the man who came out for the first time in 10 years was so calm. It is better for the magician to really come clean and confess everything to him while there is still a chance about who he really is. The magician, without thinking twice, immediately took off the cape she was wearing and said that he really does have that kind of reputation. Looking at how he was moving closer and closer to her, the girl said that he didn't need to be so suspicious. Activating the power in her hand, she brought it to the medal hanging on her chest and said that she would like to ask him for cooperation. This medal on her chest means that she is actually a polar bear knight and is part of a secret search party. She was tasked with finding the editor, so she joined the raid captain's group, and she wonders if he will help her. The system immediately notified the guy that a quest had been created with a mission, and now he needed to find the traitor hiding in the border village. Without thinking twice, he immediately grabbed the girl D'Artagnan's outstretched hand with a smile, and not paying attention to her awkwardness, energetically shook her hand and said that of course he would help. The girl blushed but did not answer, and the system immediately notified the guy that his decision melted the sorceress Vajtame's heart. The proximity and love with her has now increased by 50. Going down to get her cloak, she asked the engineer if she should put the robe back on. He replied that she should put it on and return to patrol. In fact, all his friendliness now was very feigned. Still, this girl seems very familiar to him, but he doesn't understand why. When they finally approached the wall, the guy turned to the magician and asked what clues he had about the traitor. The magician replied that after looking at the cracks, she could tell that there was a skill that she had never seen or heard of before. Before she could finish speaking, she stopped behind the guy, looking ahead at what was happening there. In that place, right in front of them, an explosive flew from somewhere and immediately exploded, raising a cloud of dust and stones upward. Opposite the people in cloaks stood a huge monster that looked like it was a fiend from hell, and behind it there were several more of the same monsters. The magician girl asked the guy to wait, saying that it was not there. And activating the magic cane, she continued, saying that she had never seen such monsters before. The engineer, in turn, did not listen to her, and walked forward asking what it means that they were attracted there by the cracks in the wall. The magician quickly replied that it looked like that. Looking at them approaching him, the monster growled something loudly, angry at them even more than before. Suddenly, a huge hand appeared out of nowhere and grabbed the monster across the body and lifted it into the air. Feeling that his air was being cut off and he was slowly beginning to die, unable to do anything, the monster began to growl loudly and protractedly. After some time, the magician said that after studying the traces on the border, she could say that before that she had not encountered such a skill, and that BJJTM why she had such a bad assumption that this was all actually connected with black magic. This unknown black substance somehow began to affect the girl VJTM's magic. Under the influence of the substance penetrating inside, the magic began to crack and collapse, as if it were created from the thinnest glass. Meanwhile, the guy took out a sword and with great speed headed towards the monsters, saying what this means, they were the guys who made a gap in the border. And then he quickly approached the monster and pierced his heart before he could do anything. Looking at the monster falling dead, not paying attention to the hedgehog sitting on its back, inspired by the battle, the guy thought that the difficulty of the mission was gaining momentum, just when he finally wanted to relax. The hedgehog sitting on the guy's back suddenly squeaked something in his ear, looking at the other monsters in front of them, and the girl, in turn, stared forward in shock at the hedgehog and the guy standing in front of her. The hedgehog on the guy VJTM's back began to gradually light up with fire, and the cloak on his back began to burn. The guy held out his fingers to him, with fire burning on them, and shouted that they needed to make as much effort as possible to win. As soon as he touched the squeaking hedgehog, he immediately activated the fusion skill of the Guildmaster and Kwang Kwang. This shocked the magician even more. She couldn't believe her eyes, however, everything she saw was real. Meanwhile, the guy had already removed his hand from the hedgehog and extended it towards the monster, pointing him in the direction. He in turn threw a fiery projectile towards the monster, leaving behind a trail of fire. The monster, who did not expect the attack, did not even have time to do anything before the projectile hit his torso and made him fall. The next moment, the projectile was completely immersed in the monster VJTM's body, and he himself began to burst from the inside. After which it began to explode from the fire hedgehog's activated fire skill, which caused spikes of flame to erupt from fireballs with a certain duration. The magician was still looking at the picture in front of her in shock, not even trying to help the guy and the hedgehog in any way in the battle. Meanwhile, in one of the game forests, the fat guy was cutting trees with a sword, leaving marks on them in the form of crosses. And he swore loudly because he couldn't believe that this was happening again, and I couldn't understand why it was so difficult to find someone who would accept this body. The dwarf turned to him and said displeasedly that there were very few trees left, so let them finish it together quickly. Fatty turned to him and pointed his finger at the tree, saying that he agreed with his dear warrior and offered to attack that tree. While he was thinking about what kind of show this man was up to this time, the archer shot at that tree. From that tree, some very evil creature, which was clearly in an unfriendly mood, immediately began running down the trunk. A fat guy immediately rushed past the rest of the team and confidently said that he would do it himself. The team members watching him marveled at his agility. After all, he was much faster than they initially thought about him. Meanwhile, the guy stopped and with a mad laugh threw the sword up, thus spinning it. But just when he reached out his hand to catch him with the words that it was actually a great honor for the monster to meet him, the sword flew past his hands and fell to the ground. As soon as he realized that he had failed to pull off the trick, his face twisted in dissatisfaction. The monster didn't waste any time and rushed at the guy, piercing his body with its horn and making him cry out in pain. One could say for sure that in comparison. With this guy, Kwang Kwang was just an angel, and he, not sparing his opponent, began to strike the guy of DJ Tian's body with his claws. He could not resist him with anything, from which he could only take blows, thinking that he had underestimated him, and he was indeed very strong. When he disappeared somewhere from that place, the monster fell to the ground, not understanding where he had gone. However, the next moment, the monster had already forgotten about this guy and turned his attention to the rest of the team who were standing aside. All that was left of the fat guy on the field was a sword stuck into the ground, as if to say that a guy with 8th grader syndrome was buried there. Meanwhile, in another game forest, an engineer pulled a sword out of the ground, asking why there were so many such monsters there. At that moment, he heard a mage girl call out to him and turned towards her, listening to what she wanted to say. However, in the next moment, he seemed to be pierced by the realization that he had already seen this somewhere. A feeling of déjà vu covered him completely. He remembered how once his deputy and magician Mingju covered his back. Quickly shaking his head, he finally came to his senses and now looked at how, having activated the last skill, the mage began to head in his direction, finally helping him with something. But the guy still saw Mingju enter again, who, unlike this magician, had fire abilities and magic. Deciding not to pay any more attention to it, the guy quickly turned away, getting rid of the obsession and focusing on the fight. Quickly approaching the monster, restrained by the magic bonds of the magician, the guy took the sword out of its sheath and chopped it into pieces. He didn't understand why, but somehow he had the feeling that he was playing with Yu Jung. Sheathing his sword, he looked out of the corner of his eye at the mage behind him, who stood calmly waiting for him. The guy thought that, among other things, this girl looks like an ideal couple with him. And again, just like with Yu Jung, he remembered how he once persuaded Yu Jung by hook or by crook to join his guild. Despite all her excuses and words that she didn't want to, he said that she was the only one who could take care of her. In response to her words that she doesn't legitimate to like it, when there are a lot of people, the guy said that VJJTM's why he suggested she try it first. Either way, it's still just a game. In addition, the guild members will definitely like her. In his opinion, the guild is something like a family. His words that without her it would definitely be something different made the girl finally agree and accept the envelope he held out to her. But in exchange for all this, she asked the guy not to leave him alone, even if he wanted to leave. The engineer pushed away his memories and looked at the magician to the side, trying to understand why he continued to think about Yu Jung. After some time, the guy suggested returning, and the three of them teleported back to the city. Turning to the magician, the engineer said that this was the first time he had seen him hug someone other than him like that. The girl replied that he likes being a pet, and he is very smart, and his magic is also good. In response to her question about whether she could give him more magic stones if he was eating so well, the guy replied that she should do as she wants. The guy turned back, thinking that she seemed to be attached to animals, and suddenly started chatting. Meanwhile, the magician asked in surprise where the guy found such an animal. Maybe he bought it. He, in turn, replied that it seemed that it was not far from the kingdom of Arthur, and it seems to be called the boss of the Rat Cave dungeon. The girl was even more surprised by this, and she asked if he was serious about being able to tame the boss. Hearing him answer that this was indeed the case, the girl stopped, looking at his back. Darkening, she asked if he really uses joint attacks, together with the former monster. He replied that actually, this was the first time he had done this, and in general I thought that in the end, nothing would work out. Saying that he generally thought that this was something impossible, he opened the doors, and with his mouth open in shock, stared there. However, the next moment, feeling the blade of a sword at his neck, he glanced sideways in his direction, not understanding what was happening now. The girl put the sword to the neck of the guy standing against the wall, whose face expressed nothing. Despite everything she said, she, with her eyes sparkling with a cold light, spoke of what she did not expect, but still, all this time it was he, the very traitor they were looking for. The hedgehog who heard this stared at him in shock, opening his mouth and eyes wide, not believing what he was hearing. The next moment, he began to break free from the girl VD Tammons holding him, starting to squeak loudly and jerk all his paws, enveloping the guy with her power so that he wouldn't go anywhere, and pulling him towards her with it. She told him that they would definitely need to talk. The engineer, held on both sides by magical force, did not even try to resist or say anything in response. At this moment, the hedgehog was still able to twist and forcefully claw the fingers of the hand of the girl holding him. When she reflexively unclenched all her fingers with a loud hiss, the hedgehog immediately jumped out of her hands and began squeaking loudly at her. The engineer, in turn, finally seemed to turn his attention to her and laughed loudly, asking if she really thinks he is a traitor. If this is true, then it's damn funny. After some time, the two of them, with the girl leading him in front of them, finally reached the huge gilded gates leading to the city. Meanwhile, in one of the dungeons, the player stood in front of the emerging dust fog as if waiting for something. The monster standing opposite him immediately rushed towards him from the depths of the cave, intending to take him by surprise. The guy immediately reached behind his back, pulling the sword out of its sheath hanging on his belt. Having pulled it out, he slashed with great speed across the body of one of the monsters who had approached too close to him. Having cut off the head of this monster, the guy rushed away from it, and using the skill sent toward the monsters, caused a small explosion. And while the monsters were stunned, he quickly approached one of them from above, thus intending to quickly deal with them. This monster immediately raised its head and growled menacingly towards the approaching guy, preparing to repel the attack. There was not a drop of sympathy or fear in the Gaivj TM's eyes as he began to strike the monster Jatam's body with great speed with his sword, finally cutting him into pieces and jumping to the ground right behind the monster without even looking back at him. From the skill they activated, the monster VJJ TM's body was torn into pieces, and dust and stones fell from the walls of the cave itself. The system immediately notified him that his level had been raised. As soon as the system asked him if he wanted to update his rating, the guy immediately shook his head and said no. He was only level 35, so why worry about the rating? This was not enough at all. And looking at the Captain VDJ TM's empty seat, Yuzhong feels uneasy. Yuzhong, being in the guild building, nervously walked back and forth without saying a word. Looking at the map, she shouted that this was a problem. After all, the guild's quest has already begun a long time ago. Even though the leader was absent and never showed up, they needed to participate in this quest. Her friend in turn said that they had lost the name of their guild, and their captain also left. Yuzhong said that she was confident that during the quest, she could again make a big name for herself. But as for the empty place at the head, in any case, they cannot fill it. Meanwhile, one of the people asked that if there is no leader, then the next best one must surely be brother. Perhaps this will be true. The guy, meanwhile, was thinking that Yuzhong had become attached to the guild. It took her a year to get close to the rest of the guild. He knew full well that everyone was just waiting for the captain anyway. They wait until the leader returns. Testing the blade for its sharpness, all he could think about now was that, like Yuzhong and the new guild, he had to change. He had to change so much that others, even if they really wanted to, would not be able to catch up with him either in level or in principle. Meanwhile, in the city, the soldiers quickly did their work, discussing it as well as the fact that they should finish this quarry as soon as possible. As soon as the red-haired guy finished everything, he said that now that the task of repairing the walls was completed, it was time to return to the raid captain. Suddenly, they turned their attention to the silhouette of a door, which they had not noticed from the very beginning and did not expect to see there at all. The magician girl who came there confidently said that they were all ordered to return. The soldiers immediately readily said that they were just about to do this, but immediately fell silent when they saw the paper being held out. Meanwhile, the magician said that a message had been received that the raid captain was a wanted traitor. And fortunately, his connection with the two of them was not confirmed. So they were ordered to follow her to the Corps of Knights, because the commander of the Polar Bear Knights has arrived. Meanwhile, the commander turned to someone and said that he was the commander of the Knights, and he was very pleased to meet him. Tied up with the help of magic and sitting on a chair, the guy asked why he was in such a good mood. In response to his words, the commander simply laughed loudly without saying anything in response, as if he was amused by this question. The next moment he fell silent, and staring at the guy with cold eyes, said that he was a cheerful fellow, just like a traitor. The guy exhaled, after which a system window appeared in front of him, which said that in fact he was a traitor to the Polar Bear Knights. Reading the words that he needed to prove his innocence to the commander of the Knights, the guy said that he did not want to do this. When the system window finally disappeared, the guy asked the commander of the Knights what convinced him that he was the traitor. Looking at the hedgehog gnawing on magical bonds, the commander asked how it happened that the boss of the Rat Cave dungeon was domesticated. The hedgehog, meanwhile, did not pay attention to the commander, all this time trying to gnaw through the bonds. And the commander continued to say that he was sure that the guy already knew this well. There is history in the kingdom of Arthur, the legend of King Arthur, who founded the state named after him. He believes that he may not explain further. In the history of the kingdom, there was only one person who tamed the boss, King Arthur. But he also tamed the monster. Little by little, drawing his sword from its sheath, he said that this was just a rumor, and it was disrespectful to say such a thing. Now that he has seen everything with his own eyes, he wonders what evidence of betrayal is still needed. And does he even need another reason? Without looking at the sword blade approaching his chest, the guy mockingly asked if he was jealous. Without ceasing to smile, he asked him if that was why he called him a traitor. If he is jealous, then why doesn't he just say it directly? The commander who listened to him said that the guy was simply crazy and did not answer his questions. The next moment, the guy Vjitam's chest was suddenly pierced through by a sword, causing him terrible pain. The engineer, not expecting this, screamed something in pain, unable to move or do anything in response. The commander in turn watched with a gloomy expression as he writhed in pain. Feeling how the blade of the sword was still in his body, the guy gradually began to understand the real picture of the world. In fact, this commander was dangerous, much more dangerous than he originally thought. Saying that he still didn't know that this guy was not the leader of the team, he again pulled out and stuck the sword into the guy JTM's body, not paying attention to his cries of pain. At that moment, a system notification appeared indicating that he had received very serious damage. An additional stimulation can cause dysfunction in his body. And the guy, in turn, at that moment, was only thinking that at this rate he would die very soon. The hedgehog, meanwhile, activated one of his skills and angrily rushed at the commander. And then, with a loud squeak, a fireball was launched in his direction, which caused a huge explosion in the place where it came into contact with a hard surface. The commander was not at all impressed, and with a mocking smile he said that he was amazed by such devotion. Still, capable traitors are more attractive. The hedgehog, in turn, tried to attack him again, but his strength and abilities began to gradually leave him. And the next moment he found himself thrown back by a powerful blow from the commander, who finally answered him, who had previously been amused by this situation. But now, looking at the guy, again holding the sword to his chest, the commander said that he believed that the magic stone that Hein was fed was working. Noticing that he still did not come to his senses, he headed towards the unconscious hedgehog and extended his hand to him. Raising him from the ground, the commander eagerly and confidently said that now this hedgehog had become his property. The guy, who came to his senses looking at him, thought that first of all he had to stop the commander of the knights. He didn't think he'd end up using the stone to summon someone, but it looks like the time has come. Therefore, he immediately summoned the Kachko slime. Kachko slime immediately began to appear behind the commander, who seemed not to notice him, and grabbing the axe more tightly, immediately swung it at him. The guy, in turn, raised his head and loudly ordered the slime to break everything it could reach. Slime swung his axe at the commander but only grazed him slightly, and he managed to dodge in time, from which the axe flew across the floor, leaving a huge dent there. The engineer began to gradually free himself from the bonds that entangled him, eventually completely getting rid of them. He put his hand behind his back and reached for his pocket, saying that he dared to touch not only him, but also his little child. Without thinking twice, the guy activated the Zookeeper's belt, which restored damage, stamina, and mana to all the user's pets. The system immediately notified him that there were 5 uses left before restoration and began the countdown. Meanwhile, the guild players, led by their leader, reached the palace, where Charon loudly shouted that this palace was simply huge, and apparently there was no one there. The second girl, looking around, said that it was simply because it looked like they were the first, and Mingju displeasedly asked where Takopa was and why he didn't be tempt come. As they approached the front desk, the NPC knight asked if they were there to receive a guild quest. The girl took the paper he held out to her from his hands and opened it. It said that on the guild's quest, they are looking for an outstanding warrior in the kingdom of Arthur. The conditions stated that she needed to choose 5 representatives from her guild to prepare for the martial arts tournament. The order does not matter, but all participants must pass a registration check. After reading this, she immediately remembered with horror that their brother was not with them now, and they would not be able to register. Because of this, she raised her head and turned towards the others, and nervously asked if the most important person had not yet arrived. At this time, the engineer, standing in front of the commander, healed himself, the slime and the hedgehog with the help of a belt, and told the commander that he was trying to resolve everything peacefully. But apparently, this would not work. A moment later, still holding his hand on the slime, he activated the connecting skill of the pumpkin slime, the muscle battery. Taking the sword firmly with the third hand and activating the skill, he said that he would first beat the commander. The system notified him that his muscles had recharged and were being used as batteries, temporarily increasing his strength and physical abilities. After that, the guy held out a sword towards the commander, and with a smile offered to finally fight each other and end it all at once. Stretching his hand forward, the commander told the guy that in fact, he wanted to know one thing from him. Little by little, restoring the severed limb, he asked if the guy would give him the answer to his question. He responded by asking why he should do this. He still called him a traitor, so what else did he need? The commander, with an insidious smile, said that if he does not want to answer, then at least let him listen to him normally. And then he asked if someone he trusted the most had ever betrayed him, someone whose word he trusted more than the arguments of others. The guy didn't VDGMT answer, looking intently at how his arm was being restored and thinking about whether NPC people were really restoring their bodies. But apparently his assumption made no sense. Then perhaps it was all black magic. Meanwhile, the commander moved his hand, which had already grown again, saying that his life was full of betrayals, and every time he recovered from this wound. And recently, a subordinate who swore his allegiance threatened him. With these words, he extended his hand, shrouded in dark energy, forward. And then he squeezed it into a fist with force, without ceasing to release dark energy out. Finally, creating a whip of dark energy, he slashed it towards the guy, who immediately jumped away from the incoming blow. The whip lashed the floor, and when the engineer asked who this subordinate was, he replied that from now on this subordinate. The next moment, the guy approached the commander and swung his sword at him, activating his control skills and muscle strike. This basic striking skill has been enhanced by a muscle skill. However, the captain easily repulsed his blows created with the help of skills and left the trajectory of the last blow, saying that he was very strong. Meanwhile, the sword in the guy of JTM's hands was severely cracked and began to crumble, as if it were made of glass or plastic. The captain said briefly that perhaps they should continue, and again he slashed the sword with his whip, this time rendering it completely unusable. And then he smugly asked what the guy thinks he did to the brat who betrayed him. Then the guy decided to use brute force and swung his fist at him, activating the linking skill of Muscle Slime, a muscle punch that amplified the energy collected by the muscles. However, the captain dodged this blow, which seemed about to reach him. And then, with anger, he himself answered his own question, which was left unanswered, with the words that he had sacrificed this subordinate. The engineer swung at him again and shouted that such a freak like him had never been asked anything. And then he fell silent and began to deliver blows at great speed to the body of the captain, who was no longer able to fight them off. When he finally delivered the final blow, the most powerful one yet, the captain immediately fell like a bag onto his back, unconscious. Meanwhile, the engineer said that they should have fled long ago, but this captain is too talkative. The next moment, the system notified him that his level, after defeating the captain, had been increased several times. Turning to the squeaking hedgehog, the guy said that this all took longer than he expected, so let him hurry up. Meanwhile, the captain, who was pointed at by the hedgehog, had come to his senses and asked the guy if he was NVDDGSMT curious about what the offering was for. And this is for the sake of a new force that will soon appear. At that moment, the doors to the building opened, and soldiers immediately ran in, behind whom stood a clearly evil magician. Noticing that the captain was defeated, she immediately took out her staff and began to activate magical power, heading towards the guy, with the clear intention of killing him. He turned towards the soldiers and shouted to them to take over the magician and deal with her. They immediately turned in her direction and took their swords out of their sheaths, saying that she would not pass by them. And while they were all busy with the magician, a creature appeared behind them and said that this was a real mess. And the putrid stench eventually penetrated there too. Meanwhile, in one of the forests of the Inra world, a guy stood and waited for someone to attack him or do something. Looking at him, those gathered there decided what to do. Still, they were told that he was just quiet, but he just looked like a Buddha stone. The guy didn't attempt to say a word, looking at the players in red and black cloaks standing in front of him. One of them, lowering his head, said gloomily that there was nothing fun about kidnapping. The second player standing in the middle began to silently activate some kind of technique, from which a circle appeared around him. That guy with long hair began to take his sword out of its sheath, asking if this was really a kidnapping. In the next moment, several blades created from mana flew past the guy standing in the middle and pierced his two comrades standing on either side of him. The hands of the guy who threw the blades at them were shackled by chains that unexpectedly flew in from several directions. Despite this, he immediately jerked towards the player with the sword running towards him, also starting to approach him. This rather surprised the player, who had hoped that two magic chains would hold him in place. That VJRTM's why he backed up and quickly slowed down, kneeling down and inserting a sword into the ground, which he began to hold on to. One of the people activating some kind of magic spell said that it was just some kind of madness to go alone against 7. Having not heard an answer, he fell silent and raised both hands higher, continuing his work and no longer being distracted from it. Meanwhile, the guy finally freed himself from the chains that bound his hands, just in time to move out of the path of the magic strike. After looking at the guy who attacked him, he asked if they were the ABC Guild from Row Online. Taking off his hood, the guy offered to unite before the end of the registration period for the guild quest. With a smile, he continued, and asked if it was not true that they simply could not lose to a guild that did not even have its own captain. Meanwhile, in a building in the capital, the engineer watched as the monster ran away from the place where he stood, saying that he would give them some useful information. The engineer did not answer, and only silently looked at the armor that had fallen next to him, immediately realizing what had happened. The monster, standing on its two hind legs, said menacingly that in fact the monster was the boss, from the myth of the founder. The system immediately notified him that the task was created based on the discovery of a guardian deity. King Arthur was the only one on the continent who was able to found a country by taming the boss monster, the guardian deity of the extinct kingdom. Reading what was written there, that he needed to defeat a mysterious guard who somehow appeared again. The guy said that he didn't know what stats he had then, but he was sure that he was quite strong. Without turning back, he asked if they were sure that he would win if he used this, and should he fight him like a boss. Picking up his sword, the guy lying on the floor twirled it before his eyes and asked if this would be too much. The mage in turn began to activate her magic and abilities, intending to attack them all with her abilities. With her attack, she hit the body of the Kachko slime, which immediately flew off in the other direction. Meanwhile, the girl asked with displeasure what kind of monsters these were and what they were doing there. The two soldiers standing opposite her immediately attacked the girl standing opposite them, screaming and asking how she dared attack their raid captain. Turning her head towards the guy, the girl said that this was all at the wrong time. The guy said that she sees that the commander of the knights has turned into this monster, and Kachko slime is actually his subordinate. Frowning, he said that no matter what she thought, who to believe or not, the decision was hers. Will she choose a monster who pretended to be the commander of the knights? Or the guy himself, who was unfairly labeled a traitor to the empire? Listening to him, the girl couldn't believe her ears. She really didn't just know what to do and who to believe. Meanwhile, the guy began to spin the sword and tell her to think about everything carefully. But now let her not bother him until he catches the boss. Having activated his abilities, the guy rushed towards the monster, not paying attention to the hedgehog, which was running with him in his direction. Approaching closer, they both activated other abilities with great speed, in addition to the usual ones, hoping to catch him by surprise. The hedgehog immediately activated his Fire Kwang ability, and without regret, he created and threw a fireball towards the monster. The monster knocked it off with one paw before it even reached him, and then he said that it seems that they are still close. Raising his paw up and activating his ability there, he asked the engineer how long he thought this would all last. The guy did not answer, and silently attacked him with a sword, and the monster, repelling his attacks, in turn said that if he survived his attack, he would tell him a story. Noticing how his paw was approaching him with great speed, the guy quickly grabbed the hedgehog and moved out of the path of the blow, which eventually hit the walls of the building. And then he shouted that he had already told him that he didn't care at all. In response to the fact that the hedgehog squeaked that his clothes were on fire, the guy replied that everything was fine and that he should not stop the flame. The monster, meanwhile, again extended both paws and began to strike quickly with them, growling that Arthur had never actually tamed it. The guy did not answer, holding the hedgehog in front of him back forward and activating the fusion skill of the raid captain and Kwang Kwang, after which he activated the flamethrower, which absorbed the aura of the raid captain and released incredibly hot flames. He could also block melee attacks. His fire collided with the monster's skill at great speed, blocking it and preventing it from reaching the engineer. Both forces put pressure on each other, and neither side was going to give in, only continuing to increase the energy in the pillars, which ultimately led to an explosion that occurred where two energies collided. Taking the hedgehog with both hands, the guy came closer to the monster and said, since he continues to chat, he will ask him, does everything seem unfair to him? The monster said that now it seems the guy is finally ready to listen to him, and he said that they are very similar. At first, they had a contractual relationship with him. As a condition of helping people in the war, he accepted the price of human sacrifice. The guy sternly said that he believed he did not keep his promise, and because of this, he is still angry with him. The monster replied that this was not so, because after tasting the blood, he could not stop the war. Humanity is dying like flies, so why do they need a victim? But Arthur still wanted peace, and said that he would sacrifice himself to stop the bloodshed. And that's why he took over his body. More precisely, he, like King Arthur, took the monster's body. The soldiers stared in shock at him, and the strip with his name on his head, unable to believe their ears that this was really true. The monster, meanwhile, said that this story was exactly what they expected. Until this man died, almost as if alive, he continued to start wars. And now, with a kingdom built on the lives of innocent people and the lineage of his blood that flows through this country, he will destroy everything. Scratching one paw, he said that he wished he could take back the words he had previously spoken to their proud knights and let them decide what they want to believe. Stretching this paw forward, he said that either the guy will remain a traitor and help him, or it will contribute to the prosperity of the kingdom. The next moment, the system displayed a message stating that the royal event had been activated. The scenario for the next task now depended on the choice made. The guy turned to the monster and said that he almost forgot, and then asked if he could ask him one more question. In a more serious tone, he asked, without hearing an answer from him, whether he had really been betrayed. When the monster again did not answer, the engineer grabbed his paw and said that in fact it was he who started the war. And also he is the one who survived, judging by what he himself said about making a sacrifice. In addition, it was he who sacrificed and still sacrifices human lives. The monster immediately snatched the paw with the wound that had healed from his hands, loudly saying that in fact, this was funny. The engineer in turn said that the wound was deep, so he did everything slowly. And as he sees, the monster was the first to propose. And looking at him, still holding the bottle of potion in his hands, he asked why he continued to pretend as if nothing had happened. Taking his sword out of its sheath, he swung it and stood in a stance without hearing an answer, with the words that he will probably repeat once again that the monster is his subordinate, and by activating the wizard skill, a double charge. And then he rushed towards the monster, activating the raid commander Josh TM's exclusive skill, Bullet Lunge, a piercing blow enhanced by a fire and frost aura. The monster, meanwhile, activated one of its skills and also swung towards the guy. His paw collided with the sword, the energy of which enveloped his paw, which was coated in its energy. Seeing what happened, the monster froze in surprise, without ceasing to hold its paw raised towards the guy. The system announced that it was an aura that envelops the weapon and increases damage upon impact. The next moment, an explosion that arose at the sight of the collision threw them away from each other. The girl opened her eyes in shock. Looking at this, it was even a double charge. This man was clearly strong. Meanwhile, the fat guy stood calmly in the middle of the field, in front of a huge number of spectators in the stands. Even though it was completely absurd, it was still simply incredible. The system announced that if the opponent did not arrive on time, Song Su would be automatically declared the winner of the final qualifying match of the royal tournament. The guy smiled and laughed, saying that his opponent shit his pants and ran away. Thinking to himself that he should be more careful, he almost ruined his hairstyle. Smiling impudently, he shouted that if you Don V. J-Man take into account the raid commander, he is the best there. Therefore, it is not surprising that he was so scared. Mingju said displeasedly that this damn idiot apparently even talks there and parodies the commander. Charon, sitting next to her, said with a smile that he was really funny, and then asked if he accidentally took the name of their guild. She answered that it was so, and putting her hand to her head, asked why only she was ashamed there. And then she looked at the guy who jumped up and asked him. This guy in turn jumped up and loudly asked how this scum dared to talk about their commander. Just let him get to him. Mingju put her hand to her forehead again, thinking with shame that this was another fan of the commander, and it looked like he would have a hard time. However, everyone fell silent in surprise as soon as they saw the royal magician walking forward and heading towards the stage. Having walked to where everyone could clearly see everything, he placed his stick straight, hitting it on the stone floor, and activating a magical hologram there, in which everyone present was surprised to recognize King Arthur. He said with a smile that he was glad to welcome all guests and residents of the Kingdom of Arthur. Relatively recently, their country became the victim of a series of unpleasant incidents. Therefore, to strengthen the position of the royal family, he wants to hire a detachment of brave knights. The guild members who remain last and win the tournament will receive the title of commander of their army. In addition, they will be given their own territory. A moment later, the king began to disappear and dissolve, not forgetting to say that in the end, he wished them all good luck. Meanwhile, the monster fighting with the engineer flew past and began to fall to the ground exhausted. Having activated the aura shift skill, which quickly moved the active aura, the guy said that based on his endurance, you couldn't be just tell that he was a boss. The next moment, with great speed, he delivered a large number of blows to the entire body of the monster. Then he said that this only means that he really is not the boss, and this is his last warning. The monster could not even resist him with anything. With a cry of pain, it flew back again from the blows that flew at it. The guy rushed after the monster, extending his sword towards him until his back collided with the stone floor. And then he put a sword to the throat of the monster, who was clearly dissatisfied and did not expect such a situation, so that after this he can confidently say that he will now become his subordinate and will be under his command. After a short silence, the monster asked if he really wanted him to give up his power to someone again. And then he asked the smiling guy if this was all exactly the same as what happened 100 years ago. He answered with a crazy smile that everything was exactly like that, and then he will be able to avenge him, but in his own way. Grabbing the sword with one paw, the monster asked what he needed in this case if he wanted to take revenge on him. The guy easily answered that all he needed from the monster himself was loyalty and honesty. Letting go of the sword, the monster replied with a smile that it was as easy as shelling pears, and then it was acceptable. Taking the sword away from the monster's neck, the guy easily cut through his hand, not paying attention to the fact that there might be a scar left there. And he extended her hand, shaking the monster D8TM's paw, saying that this was the right decision, and henceforth let him be obedient. The system notified him that a situation had arisen where the selection options were not available, and the kingdom events have been updated. He should swear an oath to King Arthur in retaliation for that he has become a boss monster and he must destroy the kingdom of Arthur. Turning his back to the monster, the guy said that in any case they would discuss the details later, because there's still something else he has to deal with. Having said this, he turned towards the magician standing to the side. Holding the sword in her hands, she looked back at him in surprise, not understanding what he wanted. And what the hell did she just see? Coming closer to her, the guy confidently said that he wouldn't repeat it to her either. Placing a sword on her shoulder, he asked if she would follow him, the master of the true king, or will be loyal to the bloodline of monsters. The girl thought for a moment, looking at the engineer and the soldiers behind him, and then she easily extended her hand to the golden token of belonging to the royal knights hanging on her chest. Then she extended her hand and threw the token back, not paying attention to the sword at her throat, saying that she believed that there was no point in announcing the answer. The engineer, in turn, reached for the token lying on the ground, saying that he liked the girl VJTM's simplicity, and he handed the token back to her, telling her to keep it because he would need it in the future. She took him away and asked how his wounds were. He, in turn, replied that everything was in a bunch. However, remembering what happened, the guy thought with great amusement that at that moment, he really could have died. Therefore now he needs to become stronger, much stronger than he was before, and bring chaos to this king. Taking off his glasses, the head of the company asked for permission to make the guy one offer he couldn't refuse. Throwing papers on the table, he said that he was offering him a 3-fold salary increase. With 1 employee and 1 person from the maintenance team to work for the raid captain, they will form a team to find the error. He will increase his salary 3 times. Crumpling the papers into a ball, he said that he would do this until this incident came to light. The developer asked in shock why they should be from the support team in that case. Tot picked up the phone and replied that he had created a separate team for the raid captain of only 4 people. This should minimize the possibility of a leak if the problem is discovered later. After another moment, he dialed the number of his manager, asking what he was going to do in that case. Meanwhile, the engineer entered the library with the words that he means that there is nothing unusual in this building. Everything looks as if it has been abandoned for a long time, but for some reason, there is absolutely no dust there, even on the books. He didn't really know what it was about, but perhaps, whatever he thought about those things, someone else thought the same thing. After a moment, the guy stopped thinking, and together with the hedgehog, who was also flipping through the books, focused on what was written in them. But judging by everything, it was still possible to think that there was something there. Perhaps a secret room in which something is hidden, and this may be the reason why the dust does not have time to settle. In that case, if you think like that, then everything is correct after all. The mission this time seems to be especially strange. He thought that even after the border protection mission, there would be no more such missions. Still, he thought that that mission was the end of the trader's mission, and there was no need to strain anymore. But in the end, he was killed by a fake knight commander of mob bosses of various levels. Just as he is the real king of the kingdom of Arthur, even despite the fact that he changed his soul, he is not as strong as ordinary bosses. In the end, he doesn't even need to fight, and even if the guy defeats him, nothing will change in the end. In the next moment, the guy caught the falling hedgehog, who barely managed to get the book he needed from the shelf. And then he put him on the shelf again, thinking that he could not believe that the mission to protect the borders was only to kill time. Judging by everything that he saw and noticed, it seems that they really want something from him. Stopping to think about it, the guy turned to the hedgehog and said that he would kick his ass if he just kept reading. Hearing everything the boy told him, the hedgehog's face twisted as if in horror and disgust. After that, with a loud squeak, he again hugged the book, looking at the boy. who in turn, looking at him, thought that Kwang Kwang's stature should increase, thanks to his hobbies such as books and magic stones. Although the fact that he can't see his status window is disappointing. And after a moment, as if he remembered something, the engineer reminded the hedgehog that he had said that he would make a weapon for him, and asked if that was true. Without waiting for an answer, he opened the system window and told the hedgehog that perhaps he would make a sword for him first. And he will make it from the things he collected during the duck slime mission. After all, he can unite all these 3 stones together. Therefore, having pulled out all the objects, he began to fuse everything into one thing with the help of magic. After a moment, he finally melted everything into one with a smile, saying that no matter what it was or became, so be it. Yellow slips of paper pasted all over the floor around the table suddenly began to glow with a yellow light that rose upwards. After that, after a short period of time, everything around the places where these bills were exploded. In the corner where a table and bookshelves once stood, there was nothing left but black smoke. And the guy himself flew to the second place behind him in the direction of the bookshelves, carrying several rows on his back. Looking at the hedgehog that jumped on his chest, the boy said that this was a very good request, and he is very sorry. The boy and the hedgehog in unison turned towards the magic sphere that the boy was holding in his hand. Meanwhile, at the place where the tournament was held, the soldiers and the magician arrived at the head of the guards, who asked what they were doing there. Not hearing an answer, he did not say anything, waiting for what they would do next. In the next moment, the mage raised her staff up and activated a magical barrier around them. Such a precaution made the head of the guard frown and asked why they needed a barrier there. One of the soldiers explained that a traitor had appeared in the border village, and that's why they returned first. The head of the guard asked in fright what this meant and what kind of traitor. The magician said that this is indeed a traitor, and it looks like he made the cracks on the wall too. And then she said that there were unregistered monsters. He also used black magic. After listening to her, the head of the guard asked with surprise why he appeared in a border village in such a case. Well, the king is in the capital. The second soldier said confidently that to some extent they still don't know. They returned immediately after repairing the walls. Pulling out a letter from his belt, the head of the guard said that first he needed to report this to the king, and they also go with him. In the next moment, the place where they were standing lit up with a bright blue light where no one was visible. And then, everything was as it was. Spreading his hands in different directions, the judge who came forward said that they had a small hitch, but now everything will go according to plan for them. And he extended his hand towards the jubilant boy, introduced the guild representative of the final boss to the jubilant crowd. Player, with the nickname Twinkling. Extending his hand to the other side, he introduced them to the guildmaster of the last guild, a player nicknamed Song Su the Best. And then he activated the field with the words that, as in the last match, all levels, states, and abilities of items will be set to the 30th level. After he explained to them what and how to do it, he began to move to his place, not forgetting to wish them luck. The guy smiled and told Song Su that he is the one who has no relation to their hen and the commander, saying that since he heard that he was using his fame for his own benefit, he would make sure that he never opened his mouth again. The guy activated the exclusive skill of the flickering electric aura. He in turn laughed and replied that it seems that he feels the raid captain's aura emanating from him. And with the words that even if he envied all this was predetermined, he began to activate his warm-up skill, which increased the attack due to muscle stimulation. Having activated the basic skills of the swordsman, they both rushed at each other, clashing in battle. Looking at the enemy, the Twinkling thought that his opponent's sword was actually much heavier than he had originally thought. He was also faster. If he had made a mistake at that moment, he would have been thrown back. He attacked him with a spear, but he still held out. Pulling towards the guy who had flown away, Song Su thought that it wasn't that simple, really. And isn't everything too burdensome? With a shout that he would show him his strong side, the fat man began to activate the exclusive technique of jumping, which instantly increased muscle and fat mass, allowing him to gain more explosive power. He said that he was just like a raid captain. The guy also activated forged resistance. And then he shouted that he would receive his physical strength skills, called the very cool spiral blow of the King of the God Emperor. This skill, which he activated a rapid rotation along the vertical axis when swinging the sword and dealt a lot of damage to the enemy. Shimmer barely dodged his blow, cursing loudly at how strong the guy's muscles really were. And he activated the skill that allows the aura to surround the whole body, extolling dexterity and brute strength, said that he is just a jerk, that he stupidly copies others. Throwing himself in the direction of the fat man, he shouted that the captain, in addition to everything, also possesses the power of the mind. And then he extended his sword in his direction, clashing with him in battle and activating a thunder strike, an attack that was as fast as lightning and dealt a massive blow to the opponent. In the next moment, the judge appeared and put his hands to his sides and ordered to stop the fight, because this is an emergency situation. Both guys stopped and exhaled incomprehendingly, sternly looking in the direction of the judge, who knelt down and raised his hands to heaven and announced that they were both announced as winners by the king. And above the guys' heads, a system window appeared, where it was written that the king of the kingdom, Arthur, was killed by an unknown entity. And with this sad news in mind, there is no longer any need to choose a guild to protect the king. In order to congratulate the representatives of both guilds for working so hard, the captain of the guard who manages the competition invited both guilds to the royal palace. The soldiers excitedly turned to the captain of the raid, saying that something very bad had happened. And while they are talking, unregistered monsters attack the kingdom. Hearing this, the guy's face twisted. He was already guessing who it could be, but still, he hoped that it was not so. Having checked the king's pulse, one of the soldiers said that everything looked as if the king had been dead for some time. And also, there is a spatial magic circle drawn and activated right next to the throne. The soldier passed on the magic stone to the engineer that he assumed that the monsters were summoned precisely by this magic circle. In the next moment, the boy spoke something to the stone, and in his second hand, to the surprise and shock of the hedgehog, a second window began to appear. The engineer remembered where and how the magic circle was activated. He was definitely in the place he remembered. And magic reacted to this thing on the floor, and it created a magic circle in the kingdom. The system immediately informed him that the mission to protect the border of Arthur's kingdom was completed. The guy angrily asked that he had felt it for some time, but why did he switch off every time something important happened? After a moment, the system informed the guy that the call was made after the completion of the mission, and subordinate monsters appeared near him. The monster loudly asked him why he sent him to work alone, and he told him to finally do something because the magic circle was activated. These ego words put the boy and the hedgehog into a stupor. They did not expect to hear something like that from him at all. In the next moment, they looked at each other as if silently reading each other's thoughts. And then the hedgehog rushed to the side of the monster and without wasting time kicked his paw, hissing something loudly in his direction. To the boy's loud question about what he meant, he answered that he meant that these guys were going to them there, and this is all because of the magic circle that he protected. He approached the engineer and took his hand with his paw. If these guys do come, the monster begs him very much not to be rude to them. Meanwhile, in the building of the Alphabet Guild, a guy entered the room saying that they always make the worst raids, and he is constantly removed. He immediately flew back into the corridor with a loud cry from the pain of the magic sword stuck in him. And in front of the guy, a second guy with long hair appeared, who held out his hand with a sword activated on it, tied to his hand with chains. The second player, to whom the murdered boy turned, immediately pulled out his sword from its scabbard, loudly shouting his name. However, he did not have time to do anything, as that player quickly approached him and stabbed him with one of the daggers. And without stopping, he ran further along the corridor in the direction of two more players, who began to say that this is the guild of the final boss. The guy immediately gripped the handles of the swords, preparing for an attack. And then he easily dodged an arrow from a crossbow flying in his direction and threw a blade in the direction of the second player with a sword. After a moment, the guy turned around and put the blade back in his hands and began to quickly approach the player with the crossbow. And then, unexpectedly for him, the same blade threw in his direction with great speed. Toth easily pierced him, killing him on the spot, right in front of another player running quickly down the corridor with a hammer on his head. Seeing this and how Taekwon quickly ran further down the corridor and turned in his direction, he swung his hammer. Taekwon, in turn, quickly hit him with several crushing blows to the torso, activating the thief's skill, a 3-step strike that inflicted 3 scarring blows. After that, he also pierced his neck, and then activated a chain strike, his exclusive skill. Who asks for daggers on chains with magic blades and shoots them? Jumping to the ground, he looked in front of him and asked into the void if someone was saying that they really went on a raid. Meanwhile, the system notified the engineer that he had completed the mission, and additional rewards would be given upon completion of the hidden mission. The status window, to his surprise, wrote that the management of troops was also affected, and he can see detailed information about his soldiers and allies. In the next moment, it seemed to the guy that something was finally beginning to come to him, and it alarmed him. But he did not have time to do or say anything, as the system began to transfer him to another location, informing him that in order to start a new mission, he would be transported to a separate location soon. That's why, after some time, He found himself right in the middle of a huge desert with destroyed buildings. The picture presented to the eyes of the hedgehog and the boy made them look around in shock, now realizing what they faced again. And the system window, having completed its work, began to disappear little by little, not paying attention to his cries that they had not even agreed yet. Looking at all this, the guy frowned, but thought that at least he had a summoning stone, and he will summon them as soon as the time of recovery is over. After a moment, he raised his head and breathed a sigh of relief from the piled-up new problems and affairs. Turning back, he immediately put a smile on his face and said that this time he would take care of him from the bottom of his heart, and then ordered to open the status window. The system notified him that this is the beginning of training. Statistics were increased due to the accumulation of experience points, depending on the type of activity. But the individual system is not provided. He could also determine the distribution of experience points, set the load for the basic statistics. Moreover, it is possible to set an additional load for items and runes. The engineer could receive hidden statistics depending on the type of activity. Hidden states could be tamed through items and runes. The user's capabilities will now be automatically analyzed and converted into combat power. Combat power in turn will be revealed if other users view the status window through skills or open quests. Looking at them, the boy said that they had grown exactly the same as during the beta phase. In the next moment, the boy turned in surprise towards the hedgehog, who ran forward with a loud squeal. Tot gave a loud squeak, gesturing as if asking why he didn't use the sphere after all. Having understood what he was talking about, the guy said something and forgot about him when the guy suddenly started talking. Perhaps they should find out what her real quality is. And then, pulling the sphere out of storage, he handed it to the happy hedgehog in his paws. He immediately caught it and began to happily twirl in his little paws, happily saying something in his own language. This was the realm of a raid captain whose class was unspecified. A magical instrument created by the raid captain. In order to use the sphere, it was necessary to fulfill a number of conditions. Looking at her, the hedgehog thought that he might lose her if he carried her with him. Therefore, he decided that it means that it is boring to keep the sphere in a safe place, and without a doubt, this is a safe place in his hat. Heard some strange sounds from the side, the guy turned there with surprise. Far away in his direction, a huge number of small blue evil goblins ran. Looking at them and how they were approaching him, the engineer was surprised and asked what kind of bullshit it was. The next moment, the system unexpectedly reported that he had unknowingly completed the mission, so his rewards were enchanted. He looked in amazement at the objects in the form of a bundle with a tree, a nameless key, and an energetic flask. However, just then, while he was examining and reading information about the last item, a herd of goblins rushed past him at great speed. At the same time, knocking him and his objects down, not paying attention to his cries and his desperate attempts to do something. He quickly ran forward, overtook the goblins carrying the logs, and asked what was going on, and what the hell was this? When they didn't respond and didn't answer anything, the boy loudly drew their attention. And then he angrily asked what it was, and why they were so restless after all. If they have a task, then let them give it to him. The goblins looked at him with calm faces, but in the end did not answer anything, and then calmly walked past the guy further down the road, leaving him standing behind himself with his finger stretched forward. Turning back, he asked if they really agreed to give him anything, but was again ignored. And to his question about why he was dragged there at all in such a case, and they didn't even let him negotiate with a car, no one answered either. Even after 30 minutes. Even after a while, he still sat in that place and thought about the fact that he would be stuck in the Astrum, which was the worst that could happen. Still, for a Korean or for a gamer, there should always be a way out, even in the worst-case scenario. A minute later, he began to feel that he could no longer bear all this tension. And after 5 minutes, he really started to lose his mind and laugh madly, looking up at the sky. Later, he stomped loudly and displeasedly on the ground, accidentally waking up a hedgehog sleeping there. And already irritated, he will ask that it can't be, and he really doesn't work. Let the system stop laughing at him and finally give him a damn task. But he still always knew that this was a bastard. Looking at the slain king, one of the soldiers asked, "It seems that the monsters were summoned with the help of a spatial magic circle." While checking the king's pulse, they remembered what the engineer had told them that first. They should report to the captain that he is a traitor, and he himself would help get rid of the monsters. Listening to what he said through the stone, the soldiers answered his question about whether they understood everything, the words would be done, and then asked him to be more careful. At that moment, the mage turned back. She noticed that a monster started to climb out of some magical space. After looking at him, she quickly ran from the place where she was standing to the second place, shouted that a monster appeared. The soldiers immediately ran to that place and quickly struck several blows on the monster's torso. The mage, in turn, also inflicted several blows and said that it was black magic, and her protective magic did not work on him. The soldiers immediately covered her and put their swords forward, telling her to leave them with them because they would take them away. The girl easily agreed with them and left the magic cane, stood behind the soldiers who looked in amazement into the magic hole in front of them, where there were a huge number of monsters. Looking at them, the faces of the soldiers were distorted. They actually did not think that there were so many, more than he originally thought. In the next moment, a sword strike flew past them, filled with energy that they had not noticed before. Despite the fact that the monsters were cut to pieces by these blows, both soldiers turned and looked behind them in shock. The captain activated his skill and started swinging his sword again, ordering everyone to move further back. He again struck several quick blows in the direction of the monsters and shouted, asking what was really going on there. All the blows reached their goals, but because the head of the guard killed several monsters, their number did not decrease, but only increased. The mage threw off her cloak and said that she was a mage, part of the search party of the White Bear Knights. And the results of the secret investigation say that the commander of the knights protecting the borders is the same traitor they are looking for. Looking at his reaction, the girl emotionally said that he tamed the monster and now fights with him. After looking at her and the captain, the soldiers fearfully thought whether everything would be all right with the raid captain now. The head of the guard was slowly dealing with the monsters and thought he shouted to the mage to return to the White Bear Knights and report the whole situation to them. Meanwhile, the girls went into one of the rooms, discussing the fact that the brother is so scary when he gets angry, and he definitely crushed them. Mingju looked around and asked where he had gone after all this commotion. Her friend said with a smile that it is possible if she is talking about such, and perhaps it all started a long time ago. The second girl said that she thinks that the situation is getting out of control, so they should meet with the guildmaster and fix everything. Minchu, in turn, asked if she really thought they would be able to stop him. She believes that they should not interfere now. If even the captain of the raid could not stop him, then how will they do it? The girl to whom she answered asked if, in her opinion, they should be inactive. Meanwhile, in one of the game forests, the bandits sitting around the campfire burst out of their seats. They looked in disbelief at the player who appeared with 2 swords in his hands, and his face was covered with a cloak like the rest of his body. The guy with a scar on his face, not noticing the sword approaching his face, asked what kind of bullshit it was. And in the next moment, he was killed by a guy who quickly approached him, who cut him into pieces. The rest of the players whom he scared asked what the hell he was and where he had come from. The guy in turn did not answer anyone and took both swords more firmly in both hands. Quickly running past the players in front of him, the guy attacked them with both swords, ignoring their screams and running past them. And then he quickly turned back into a jump, looking at how they were writhing in pain and removing the blades from their bodies. After that, he again grabbed the sword more firmly and again drove it into the body of the unbeaten enemy. Noticing that they finally died, he turned to the other bandits who shouted that they should shoot him. However, the arrow did not reach its goal. Being deflected by the boy's sword, it penetrated the back of one of the bandits, but did not kill him. The guy turned to another man who was swinging a sword at him with a loud cry heading in his direction. However, he easily dodged his blow, and the second guy, whose back was hit by an arrow, finally got to his feet and took the arrow out of there. And while the guy with the long hair was dealing with his partner, he again tried to shoot him in the back with a crossbow. The guy easily dodged, and from this arrow, put that player for himself as a shield in front of him. Letting go, he bent down and threw one of his blades in the direction of the guy with the crossbow. This blade pierced his body through, leaving no possibility of any resistance, and sent him flying far back from the force of the blow. The guy with long hair, in turn, continued to hold his hand outstretched in his direction, not saying a word in front of him. Meanwhile, Minju said that she had in mind all this time what they should finally show them. Hearing a cough behind him, the guy turned in surprise to one of the bandits who survived his attack. And then he smiled madly, activating Taekwon's skill, Chain Hail, a temporary attack from stabbing tools reminiscent of hail. Looking at this, the player fearfully asked why he needed all this in the end. Minchu, holding a coin in her hands, turned to her friends and said that they should do all this just so that in the end they would pay for everything. And on the field where Taekwon was, there was finally no one and nothing left except for the swords that stuck into the ground. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, Shimmer and Song-Soo looked at each other with displeasure, not happy with this outcome. Meanwhile, the head of the guards, as if not noticing the increased tension, said that such young people had come to the finals, and this means that a bright future awaits them. Song-Soo replied that he was a little embarrassed by such compliments, and with a twinkle he said that he was lagging behind in many ways. The head of the guards did not answer anything and said that because of one incident, they had to simply stop the fight. and this is simply amazing to reach the final at their age. Both guys locked eyes again, saying that if it was them who came out, everything would be better, and they would be the center of attention. The head of the guards, listening to them, smiled again and said that youth is simply beautiful, as it has come to life, and he will still tell everything quickly. After the polar bears and the black tiger, the two Whitener guilds will become knights. As for the name, the Golden Bird is very suitable for them. All the same, since the palace was attacked, now it is the captain and the Knights of the Black Tiger who will defend it. The union of two guilds, the Knights of the Golden Bird and the White Bear, whose commanders are still unknown, and their task will be to find the traitor. And then he said that they have little time, and he will learn the details from the Knights of the White Bears. He is very interested in what they will do now. The engineer, meanwhile, was still looking displeased at the runestone in his hands. He did not understand why 24 hours lasted so long. Runestones are duplicated and created for the purposes of users. The spellcaster could name a target holding a cloned runestone. It is possible to use a runestone. Ego could be used as a walkie-talkie at any time. He asked to hear the monster Cola, and even managed to get rid of the goblins who had been annoying him so much all this time, and even checked the various items that he had in the form of a necklace and a soul collector's necklace. But all the same, they are all these goblins. No matter how much he kills them, they appear and appear, only becoming more in number. Ego simply brought out the fact that exactly when he decided to become stronger, they simply decided to ruin everything he built. Hearing some strange sound, he immediately turned away from his occupation and turned back in his direction. Judging by everything, it was the sound of an explosion of a house or building, which after all had been so meticulously built by the monsters, and now it was completely destroyed. The guy immediately jumped up and ran in that direction, thinking that this was finally the end, and finally everything turned out. However, running there, he realized why Seiya had been feeling so strange all this time. This house collapsed simply because of poor construction. Now it all seemed to him that this was precisely his task as an architect. Suddenly, a notification from the system appeared over his head that if the hero dies or is caught by the Knights of King Arthur or the user, then the game is over. And it is possible that errors may occur during the execution of the task, so let him make sure he's evacuated before a new mission appears. Staring at all this, the boy thought that the mission that did not appear did not seem to be mocking him at all. But still, the fact that the system believed that he would die if he met the knights brought him out of his mind, so he smiled maliciously and asked aloud if it would be like that. Meanwhile, in the company of Astrum developers, there was information hanging directly in the corridor that the creation of the team specializing in Astrum errors was finally officially confirmed. And then, there was the retargeting of the names, surnames, and positions of the people in the team. People immediately gathered there discussing the fact that there seems to be only one elite, and with them all errors will be corrected. Someone even said that they had heard that the salary had been increased. A developer passing by, carrying boxes to his office, looked in that direction with surprise, hearing that it was necessary to discuss all this directly in front of the president's office. Thinking that he would need more time to think, he again went towards his office. All this, which is happening right in front of the president's office, and the mistake of the raid captain, all this directly put pressure on him. To his surprise, as soon as he entered the office, the commissar's monitor flashed a notification that a historical error had been noticed. Meanwhile, the system displayed a notification in front of the engineer that he was on the run, and if his character dies, or is seen by King Arthur's knights or users, then the game will be over. After that, a huge number of red windows of the system appeared in front of him, where it was said that a reward would be assigned for him, and a punishment would be assigned. He also had a debuff. The more opponents there are, the more his characteristics decrease. Reading about the debuff in the form of the fact that any authority turns into stupid fame, he said that he expected it, but still it's a little too much. Reading all this, the hedgehog smiled maliciously, looking at his face as if mocking him and the fact that he was scared. In the next moment, he stared in amazement at the new system notifications that appeared in front of him. It was written there that an evil mind was created, and now, with high charisma, the effectiveness of their teams is increased to the maximum. However, if an unreasonable command is used, those to whom the command is given will treat it with hostility. The guy clapped his fist on the hand and said that once it's like that, that's good, and everything should go well. The goblins finally got out from under the rubble of the destroyed house and headed towards it, and the engineer himself, looking around with a smile, said that perhaps the time has come, and now they must stand to the end. After some time, the goblins with cones on their heads looked ahead in amazement and tiredness, not understanding what they really wanted from them. The hedgehog standing on the mountain in front of them put his hands on his sides and hissed something like words about how now they have become slightly useful for the mission. While the hedgehog was busy with this, the boy carefully examined the map of the area, a little far from everyone. Thoughtfully putting his hand to his lips, the boy thought that, contrary to expectations, the area was actually not so bad. After a moment, a hedgehog ran up to him and squealed something with readiness, politely explaining that everything was finally ready. The engineer grabbed the card and happily said that it was just great, and then perhaps they would advance. Returning to the goblins, he turned to them and said that they had never been taken seriously. And he asked if it is not because they are so weak. Apparently that is why they tried so hard with their weak skills. Defense was built, although in the end it was still destroyed. The goblins listened with open mouths to what he was saying. After all, he seemed to be reading all their soaps and speaking them out loud. Noticing how they fell silent in amazement, the boy joyfully shouted that in that case, he would simply give them all a dungeon. All the goblins immediately began to shout jubilantly, raising their hands in the air, rejoicing that they would finally have a home. The hedgehog, in turn standing next to the boy, looked admiringly at the whole jubilant crowd, also rejoicing in it. However, in the next moment, the engineer angrily shouted that in such a case, they would immediately go down and bring him the material. The expression on the hedgehog's face immediately changed, and he looked at the engineer in disbelief, not understanding what he was really up to and why he was doing it. Meanwhile, in one of the game forests, players calmly hunted game mobs and monsters. The archer said that it was not important at all, luck or not, but still their guildmaster made it to the finals. One of the players confirmed his words and said that they are definitely in the right guild. After all, they were appointed knights of the guild of the final boss. The dwarf said that this is all because their master knows how to annoy people. He said that they should continue in the same spirit until the knights were called. He immediately became alarmed, asking why it was so quiet there. In the next moment, Zirdia quickly approached one of the mobs and cut him in half with one blow. And then he activated the swordmaster's basic skill, the gravity sword, which activated a heavy swing towards the opponent. He began to attack the mobs again, shouting that no one will stop him, and this is simply disgusting. Zirdai turned to the dwarf and called him a friend, loudly ordered to finish him off and take a break. The boy looked at him in surprise, thinking that something is always wrong when he calls them comrades. So it happened, and Song Su with a loud cry went towards one of the players standing away from the other members of the Ego team. And then, scowling maliciously, he pointed his finger down and said in syllables that this is all his territory. The guy asked with pride what he had in mind. He waved his hand and said that this is his territory even from yesterday's hunt, so let him fail. Noticing that he was not going to leave, he took out his sword and asked if he would teach him game etiquette in that case. In the next moment, a dwarf quickly approached him and hit him on the hand, shouting that he was thinking why they were being reprimanded, and that's it. While the rest of the team was beating him, the archer carefully bowed and apologized to the player, saying that they were at a transition age and he would understand them. The guys beat up the fat man and said that if he gets reprimanded again, they will eventually be banned for a week. Meanwhile, the engineer with a creepy smile said that in just 20 minutes they managed everything. Still, this evil mind is a useful thing. The hedgehog began to laugh merrily, looking at how the goblins tiredly wiped the sweat from their foreheads. And the guy didn't seem to notice that they were tired, and ordered one of the goblins to move the house there until the effect of the potion wore off. All the goblins began to gesticulate unhappily, as if unhappily asking if they really had to work again. Looking at him with a terrible look, he said that everything is so and then asked if they would not obey. The goblins muttered something displeased again, and the guy looked at his wrist, told them to shut up, and said that they had 30 minutes to finish. The goblins again complained that he doesn't even have hours, but he still pretends to be. The guy looked at them and said that in the end they do everything anyway, and why is it necessary to infuriate the ego in the first place? Taking out the stone, he said that perhaps they should return to what they originally started with. And then that time released monsters that immediately began to materialize right in front of him. The bear said that he felt magic and very strong. The guy said that that's why he called him, and let him tell everything faster. The guy's eyes gradually darkened when he asked if it was the same. This magic was very familiar to him. The guy, looking at his condition, asked what was wrong with him, and did he lose his reason and ability to speak while he was leaving. The monster was holding his head, writhing in pain, and looking at it, the guy thought that maybe something had been done to him. Then this explains why he was relatively weaker than the boss. Realizing this, he loudly shouted curses because it was already clear. He forgot to give the monster a living potion, a vial filled with liquid magical energy. And it can be used to clean something. Quickly taking out a vial from his storage, he opened it and poured the liquid towards the monster. The whole space around the bear became illuminated with a bright white light, completely absorbing the ego's body. As a result, he fell face down right in front of the guy. Gradually, both the dust and the light dissipated. He opened a view of the full picture of what happened. Looking at him in shock, the engineer asked what it was and what it was. Is there really some kind of malfunction? The system notified the guy that someone had cursed Arthur's kingdom. The magic that was associated with the kingdom has disappeared, and the one who imposed the curse is dangerous. And now Cola's attribute was borderline treason. The engineer thought that everything was as he thought. He had to give this wheel from the very beginning. Just like with the mission with Kwang Kwang, he must make the right decisions. Rising to his paws, the bear began to shake himself off, asking if he really still didn't understand anything. Putting his paws on his chest, he said that since he did not remove the curse now, perhaps, he thinks that he is simply irresponsible. However, the guy and the monsters seemed not to listen to him, being shocked by his new look and voice. While the engineer was laughingly asking if he understood what he was really talking about, the hedgehog ran closer to him and happily punched him in the stomach. Looking at his paws, the monster said that he would lose his strength and body, and of course he was furious. It was at that time, right in front of him, he appeared and extended his paws to him, as if he already knew everything and gave him a powerful power. He planned his revenge with her, which he had dreamed about for so long. But he did not imagine that such power was a responsibility. Without ceasing to keep his paws on his chest, the monster said that all this continued until he discovered the magic circle. He did not notice the shadow that appeared behind him and continued to say that those guys were heading to this kingdom, or to put it simply, the continent. Hearing how something asked if he was there, the boy raised his head and frowned at him, and the system immediately notified him that he was now the target of someone who was spreading black magic throughout the kingdom. Minju did not like to miss training. She was sure that her physical form helped her. Therefore, she regularly visited the guild gym, where she could run on the treadmill, admiring the view of the garden through a huge glass window. She enjoyed the feeling of speed and freedom that running gave her. Hearing her call on the phone, the girl immediately picked up the phone and answered it. The person who called her asked how she was and said that it was Cho Yeonbi, a researcher from the IGPO company. As soon as he said that the captain of the raid has recently had health problems and therefore he called her as his guardian, the girl's face changed. He shouted loudly that he meant it. She immediately pressed the stop button, stopping the treadmill. With her hands buried in her knees, she more calmly asked what other problems he had. And isn't this a problem with the supply of nutrients? The guy replied that they are not sure about this, but this is an unusual case, and they are very sorry that they scare you with this news. She didn't answer anything and took the towel from his hand and asked if they were sure he was all right. Still, she couldn't wait that long. The guy, in turn, said that they are doing everything possible and are creating a special team to solve his problem. He finished speaking with the words that as soon as everything is over, they will contact him, and now they are asking her to keep it a secret for now. The girl asked if he thought that the guy would wake up, and the researcher answered that, as he had already said, it was the first time they had encountered such a person. Having correctly assessed his stumbling block, the girl swallowed and said that she understood everything, and let him call then if he gathers to visit. After that, she exhaled tiredly and sat down on the bench for a press, immediately burying her forehead in her hands, not knowing what to do next. Looking at her feet, she quietly said that she still didn't understand anything. Meanwhile, in front of the engineer appeared some terrible monster of enormous size, with a collar on its neck. The demon girl sitting on the monster's head asked the monster in front of her how he became so cute and small again. The monster began to answer in fright, asking why he had come at all, and the engineer and monsters standing behind him stared at the stage in front of them with round eyes. And in the next moment, the guy's lips trembled with barely restrained laughter. He did not understand what it was, and did they really have a kindergarten simulation there now? Leaning forward and picking up the runestone that had fallen to the ground, he asked what that boy was like. He ignored his question and asked the monster in front of him with a smile if he had accidentally opened the magic circle. The engineer got quite angry about this. He couldn't stand being ignored, and so he said again that he had asked a question about who he really was. The boy got rid of the monster, and with a malicious smile asked if it was necessary for him to be answered in the end. The boy himself was already shaking with barely restrained anger at the monster and at everyone around him. He said that first these circles and goblins, and now this boy. It is better for him to listen to what the elders say. Otherwise it will be worse. The demon finally got off the monster and let him off the leash, not forgetting to tell him to do so that he would finally stop muttering. Listening to his cries for him to go and play with his friends, the monster rushed towards the creature standing in front of him. Looking at the speed with which he approached him, the guy confidently clenched the runestone in his fist and frowned. Duck Slime, which ran past the boy, immediately stood opposite him and bent down and butted heads with the monster, preventing him in this way. And then, as if trying to keep his balance, he stuck the hammer into the ground, causing it to crack and create a hole there. While he was trying to cope with the opponent and push him further, he told him in his own language to stop pretending that he was strong with such and such muscles. After that, he began to swing his fist at him, activating the individual's muscle battery skill. Using mice for the battery temporarily increased strength and physical skills. He swung his paw in the direction of the monster, and the monster in turn swung the fist of the same paw in the ego's direction in the same way. In the end, both blows reached their targets, and the monsters hit by them from the blast wave flew in different directions from each other. Duck Slime quickly braked behind the stone-faced guy who was looking at all this, and then, with a malicious expression on his face, he again rushed towards the monster, preparing to attack him again. The second monster, in turn, got up just as quickly and rushed towards him, preparing to attack him in return. Slime swung, activating the blow with the explosive energy gathered with the help of the muscle battery, and with one blow unhindered, he hit the monster right on his insolent face. And then, noticing that he is not even defending himself in any way, the slime began to inflict a huge number of quick blows on the monster's body, causing it to fly away from the slime. Looking at this, the slime grabbed the hammer standing behind him and activated the ability associated with it, and swung with all his might. The demon, in turn, stopped laughing and looked shocked at the picture presented to his eyes, not believing what he was seeing. Slime spun his hammer with force, and just as quickly and unexpectedly struck several blows at the monster's body, leaving him no chance of victory and sending him flying far ahead. After that, he smiled evilly, looking after him, as if jubilant at the fact that he really got such an easy victory over a monster that many considered strong. Meanwhile, in the guild building of the final boss, Minju sat thoughtfully and nervously bit her nails on her hands. After that, she said, looking at the writing on the table, that two problems suddenly appeared in the guild. And the first, these are 43 members of the ABC Guild. Because of all this, the kingdom now requires them to work with the best Song Su, who has brazenly chosen the name of their guild. While she sat in a rage and asked what was going on, her friend, looking into the system window, said that they had another problem. After that, she approached Minju and showed her an open chat with the words that someone posted a photo of the chat, one-on-one, where there is a user with the nickname Kaitan Rita. And there it is shown that the messages have been read. This caused quite a stir on the internet. While Minju continued to peer into the system window, the girl said that some unregistered guild member had just sent her a message. And then she asked if there was still some kind of panic in the comments of the raid on YouTube. Meanwhile, the engineer, holding a stone in his hands, read the characteristics of the ego. Apparently, it was a runic stone for brainwashing, which acted for a specific purpose during a certain period of time. After reading everything and pointing to the characteristics window in front of him, the guy asked if the monster had killed himself with the help of this stone. Not hearing an answer, he approached the monster standing with his back to him and regretfully said that he had finally lost his strength and body. He silently listened to his words about what tormented him and what he had become, not saying a word, not answering or denying his words. Looking at this scene, the demoness carefully and with surprise said that he is the strongest among all his subordinates that he has. However, he did not have time to persuade, frightened by the sudden appearance of a guy in front of him who said that he would gladly correct his habit of interrupting. But judging by the wound that he sees on his body, which he so painstakingly heals with his hand, it seems to him that he has already been wounded somewhere. Activating his special skill, squatting to intimidate the enemy, using energy, the guy asked if he had been hurt while he was trying to attack the kingdom. The demoness didn't answer, wondering what kind of nonsense it was, and why he suddenly became so terrible. The hedgehog, in turn, took more air into his lungs and said something as well, as if awkwardly asking to become someone he is not. The demon, looking at all this, opened his eyes wide from fear and pain. When he thought about it, because of it, some familiar feeling of fear appeared in him. The guy in the next moment stretched out his hand to him, and the demon girl shouted in response, Rio SS Erds Roostjer, Rio Ergerdeg, Rio Erdzerds, Riris Roostjs, Reards SKJS Erds Eskak Rurgerdegger. He in turn said that it wouldn't work like that, and took out a potion from their inventory, saying that to begin with, they would fix exactly that. Quickly opening the flask, the guy in one movement splashed the contents of the flask directly on the wound of the demon girl, hoping that at least this way it would heal. Looking at how the guy's face darkened and a cruel smile appeared on him, the hedgehog began to run away with a squeal, not wanting to break his psyche. And the guy said that since he hasn't started speaking yet, let him repeat it 5 more times, and apparently this will be enough. Suddenly, his gaze fell on the stomach of the demon, where even after all the manipulations, the wound from the weapon was still bleeding. This made the guy swear in fright and ask why it didn't work, because it should have. Dusonanok said with a smile that he could ask as much as he wanted. After all, he is the 3rd generation of the great demon king. His name is Kimro Machoa, and he asked if the guy really thought he could help. The system immediately notified the guy about a new task to heal the Prince of Demons. He needed to heal his ego within the time limit. He received a penetrating wound during a raid on the kingdom. All the monsters except Kolya were frightened and bewildered and asked if this was true, and if he really was the son of the King of Demons. If this is so, then what is it all about with his name? Kola in turn tried to be serious and remind them that he had already said that, and it was possible not to be so rude. The next moment, the boy coughed and vomited a huge amount of blood, and the health scale above the ego's head quickly began to drop to a critical point. As soon as he fell unconscious to the ground, the hedgehog immediately ran to his side, and the boy, looking at the timer that showed that he had a time limit of only 10 seconds, angrily asked what the hell it was now. Meanwhile, the hedgehog had already run up to the demoness and confidently began to extend his paw to his forehead, intending to check his temperature. Angered by what happened next, he looked at the demon boy in sorrow, understanding why he was feeling so bad now, and he fainted because of all this. In the next moment, Kwang Kwang turned towards the boy, continuing to hold his paw on the boy's forehead, and hissed that he apparently still had a fever. Meanwhile, the engineer continued to look in amazement at the new task, rereading it again and again. But when he heard what the hedgehog said, he smiled at the idea that came into his head and told everyone not to panic, because he had an idea. After that, he activated the storage system and took out the Tree of Resurrection from there, which was used to bring a person back to life with the help of a powerful energy that does not exist in this world, but it could not be used on oneself. Having taken it, he, with a terrible smile as if from Satan, a novice began to approach the demoness, asking everyone if the resurrection of the dead is also considered something like healing. The demon girl, who had come to her senses, looked at the boy in fright, thinking that he really was a demon, and did not pay attention to the hedgehog, who continued to hit him in the face with his paw, even though he had already woken up. The demon boy in the room saw not someone who wanted to help him, but a real demon, who with an activated blade came closer and closer to him, saying that everything would be fine, and that he should not worry. All the same, it will become much better very soon. The hedgehog, who had turned towards the guy, also started to look at the guy in fright, understanding why the demon girl would turn away from fear and horror right now. In the meantime, the system informed the guy that he would tirelessly heal the prince within 10 minutes. In the event of the prince's death, the ego cursed with grief will be activated. This forced the boy to abandon his plan and with sadness dissipate the blade that was on his finger. It was really far for him. Now he had to think about plan B, which initially might not have existed. Meanwhile, the monster turned to Slime, who was carrying a log on his back, forcing him to draw attention to himself. When he asked in his own language what he wanted from him, the monster pointed to the working goblins and asked how he even organized the work and made them all work. Slime showed his muscles with a smug smile and said in his own language that they were just working there. And then he asked if there were any problems with the harvest. The monster didn't answer anything and headed towards the block, standing on the side saying, "What a stupid idiot he really is, who doesn't understand anything." After that, he began to ask them to climb onto the blocks little by little, saying that since the captain is counting on them, then they too, in any case, should do everything possible. Duck Slime, who arrived in time, raised his hand and with one hand lifted the monster to the place he wanted to climb. Although the monster didn't like it, he still thanked the slime, saying that he was a little dumb, but kind and responsive. Slime immediately leaned towards him and smiled, saying that he is really very kind and strong, and this means that he is kind-hearted. The monster did not respond to his words and began to clap his hands, attracting attention. And when that didn't work out, he began to draw more air into his lungs, to later growl loudly in the direction of the goblins, activating the basic skill of the beast, the roar which if used in the direction of weaker ARVGs instilled fear in them. Hearing this roar, all the goblins here turned in his direction in fear, distracted from their work, which they were doing. Looking at the slime and the monster standing in front of them, the goblins were frightened and began to discuss the fact that this monster is really very scary. In the meantime, he stretched out his paw and said loudly that this was an order from the raid captain, Red goblins answer for logs, blue goblins answer for stones. The green goblins were supposed to hand out and distribute the iron. All the goblins listened to him immediately with a loud cry and went back to work, not paying attention to his words that this should help. Meanwhile, the monster picked up the papers, checking them with the words that this is a special assignment, specified and signed there personally by the raid captain. He frowned when he said that the responsible task given to him was actually the construction of a defensive fortification and a defensive tower. The little demon slowly opened his eyes after falling into a faint again, and the first thing he saw in front of him was a guy sitting across from him, looking thoughtfully into the distance. Little by little, he opened his eyes completely, covering them with the second hand from the bright light of the burning sun, beating directly on his eyes. After that, he looked to the side where there was a used first aid kit, potions, and similar things. However, all the same, the system window did not disappear and reminded them that 6 minutes remained. He again shifted his gaze from the medicines to the guy sitting on the stone with a choked breath, who was staring blankly at the ground in front of him. Seeing that he finally woke up, the guy bitterly said that in any case, this is not even a special task, and isn't it too complicated if you take into account all these aspects? Looking at him, the demon thought that apparently the boy is fighting so hard for his sake and for the sake of saving him from death. The engineer asked if there would be no hints at all. Even after the ban on the resurrection tree, there were none. He put his hand to the demon girl's forehead and said that demonic beings can receive only demonic power. The guy didn't understand anything again, so he turned to the hedgehog, asking him what kind of demonic power it was. Then he spread his hands in response, as if asking, but how does he know about this? If this is a demonic force, then everything becomes more or less understandable. The engineer remembered a monster that used dark energy that he once killed. And looking at the magician, she calmly said that it is possible that there is a connection with black magic. Adding 2 plus 2 was not a difficult task for the guy, and he immediately pronounced that judging by everything, then they're very similar to each other. In order to test his theory and find out about all this, the boy took out a runic stone and called Yina on it, wanting to learn the details that interested him from her. Ginny, who did not expect that she would be called, turned in surprise to the runic stone from which he was called, and responded to his call. He did not waste time and asked if she could come to him there to discuss something. The girl replied that she is definitely not there now because the guard captain is looking for her. After a little silence, the guy finally said that he understood her and asked in that case if she had ever heard of demonic power. The girl surprisingly answered that demonic power is probably some kind of forbidden magic, just like the black or dark arts. The guy listened to her and asked if he wanted to use her. The girl calmed down and incredulously asked if he was talking about forbidden magic. If he needs it exactly now, then the only way to use it is only a runic stone. The guy asked again if it was a runic stone and nothing more, and heard an affirmative answer, quickly thanked her. Right before the eyes of the surprised girl, the runic stone disappeared, and the guy himself left without even saying goodbye, but only thanked her for her help. However, Ginny didn't even pay attention, looking away in embarrassment, thinking about the boy's words. Meanwhile, the engineer held the runic stone in his hands and, looking at it, said that it must be used right away. And then he directed his ego in the direction of the demon, activating the ability of the runic stone, the magic injection. For this, the magic of magic injection was used to achieve the goal within a certain amount of time. The flow of dark energy was directed towards the demon. The system reported that this ability could only be used by a target in a brainwashed state. Looking at what the system was writing to him, the guy frowned. He did not expect that everything would be so complicated. Then the guy began to repeatedly activate the ability of brainwashing, which acted for a specific purpose during a certain amount of time. However, the system repeatedly gave an error and wrote that the brainwashing was not performed due to the strong magic resistance of its target. Meanwhile, the monster was sitting on a huge stone, looking at the diagram and map drawn on it, not paying attention to everything else. While he was sitting on this block, the slime, in turn, with a smile on his face, happily dragged him towards the construction site, humming something under his breath. Suddenly, the monster stretched out its paw and told him to stop in that place, which the monster immediately did, wiping the sweat from his forehead, not noticing the monster's gaze on him. With a malicious smile, he muttered to himself that he doesn't need to be smart, since his body works so well. And then turning back and filling his lungs with more air, he shouted loudly, summoning the general gathering of goblins. They did not make themselves wait long and at the same moment rushed to him, throwing all their work where it was. The monster, looking at them, ordered the blue goblins to go and put stones on the outskirts. The red goblins were again responsible for the tree, and the split goblins had to follow the slime and set a trap. The goblins who rose to their feet at the same moment shouted in their own language that they already understood everything. After looking at them, the monster rather turned away and turned towards the slime, wanting to give him some instructions as well. However, he immediately fell silent and did not finish what he wanted, fearfully looking at the girl who appeared out of nowhere in front of him. Meanwhile, there were only 3 minutes left to save the Prince of Demons, and you could see how he was already slowly dying, and he didn't have much time left. The hedgehog ran up to the guy in fright and said that the runic stone didn't work either, and then asked what they needed to do in that case. Lowering his head, the boy said bitterly, frowning, that he had done everything in their power except for the Obnoi thing. And then he approached the demoness with the words that he knows that he cannot answer him and say something, so let him just shake his head or turn his head. And then he adjusted his belt and said that with this belt, his characteristics and vital forces could be returned somehow. Looking at him, the demoness grimaced, thinking to herself why he was pulling and not using it as quickly as possible. However, to his surprise and horror, the next moment the guy said that he knows, but he can't use it even if he wanted to. Because in order to use this belt and save the demon, he must become his subordinate and listen to everything he says. And then lowering his head, he said that of course it's not a demonic force or something like that, and maybe he won't get better at all. But in any case, this was his only chance for survival, and the possibility that he would not die in a few minutes in agony. Looking at him, the demon began to think whether to trust him, or better not to do this and let himself die. The engineer, with confidence in his eyes, held out his hand to him and asked if he believed and trusted him. The demon was not able to answer him immediately. Being touched by everything that was happening, that's why he wanted to cry. However, looking at how the demoness held out a trembling hand in response, the hedgehog folded his paws on his chest, clearly not happy about it. The demon began to stretch out a trembling hand in the direction of the boy's hand, intending to take his ego for it. However, at that moment, a voice was heard telling him to cast down the demon, and after him, the demoness herself appeared, extending her leg towards the guy, getting ready to kick him. What she did at the same moment, that's why the boy flew away far away from the demon child, and the one who remained with his hand stretched up. The demons are still lying on the ground, looking at the leg in front of their face with displeasure and surprise. The guy quickly turned over and braked with one hand holding onto the ground, and then he asked the appeared creature who she was and where she came from. He angrily held out his sword in her direction. He asked where they all come from, and why exactly when it is not necessary at all. The girl, in her turn, went down to the ground and sat down, asking with a smile if he was really running into a conflict since he was talking so rudely. Listening to all this, the demon girl clenched her teeth in anger, thinking that everything is really wrong, and hoping that this red-haired jerk will finally say something sensible. The demoness rose to her feet, and looking at the guy who extended the blade of the sword in her direction, asked what he was going to do only as a prince of demons. And the engineer, in turn, activating one of the abilities on the sword, answered loudly that he was going to make it his subordinate. Looking at this, the hedgehog put his hand to his forehead and shook his head, and the little demon started to tremble in fright, realizing that they could not save him now, because there were only a few minutes left. The demoness, looking at the guy with an impudent look, mockingly asked who exactly he wanted to make his subordinate. The guy grimly pointed at him and then pointed at himself with his finger and said with confidence in his words that he wanted to make him his subordinate. And then he swung his sword and rushed to the side of the demoness standing there, who immediately disappeared from that place and flew up. After that, she quickly approached the guy and swung at him, loudly asking how he dares to treat the demon prince like that. The guy did not have time to think about what was wrong with her and why she was so fast. He had to dodge the blows flying at him. The girl, in turn, shouted that she understands that he is still a child who brings many problems every day, but his statement is completely offensive. Looking at this, the hedgehog laughed, and the demoness wanted to die of shame in turn because he was already on the verge of an ignominious death. The engineer again quickly dodged a blow with his hand that flew in his direction. Even though the demoness was fast, he was even faster, and therefore he bent down and swung in her direction before her next blow had time to reach him. However, the demoness also quickly noticed the attack directed in her direction, and with light movements dodged from the trajectory of the guy's blow. Looking at her, the guy thought that she was very different from ordinary succubus, although she had simple attacks but very powerful ones. Meanwhile, the demoness attacked him again, speeding up quickly and thrusting her fist in his direction, hoping to catch him by surprise. With one hand, the guy caught the fist flying at him and said with a smile that she had very good taste. And then, to her surprise and shock, he asked her if she had cut her hair because she was supposed to have long hair. Hearing his words, the girl froze in embarrassment, unable to say anything to him, and the guy in turn thought that here he was, his chance. Meanwhile, the monster, holding his head, tried to understand how that succubus knew their location at all, and it doesn't matter how strong the raid captain is, he can't handle it. Slime confidently said that he didn't need to worry about the raid captain. The monster replied that it is easy for him to talk, because all the same, only his muscles are worried about him. He said that the point is that she is not an ordinary succubus. He took hold of her head again and began to explain what was wrong with her. The whole point was that in order to focus more on the battles, she cut off her hair filled with energy and magic, and all this made her a perverted succubus. Slime, not understanding anything, stepped aside and picked up a stone block, asking the monster what was so strange about it. Without waiting for an answer, he saw some kind of black hole under the stone block and fearfully asked what it was and where it came from. Looking at it, the monster also tried to understand what it was and why it was covered with a concrete block. The answer was found by itself, and it turned out to be an ordinary concrete well, which was even more strange. Therefore, the monster turned to leave, not forgetting to say that it might be dangerous and Slime better cover the well with a large stone again, not listening to his questions about why this hole is so big. The engineer came closer and grabbed the discouraged demoness by the hand, saying that she was loyal, and besides, just an excellent fighter. But at this rate, if they continue to fight, finding out who is stronger, the demon girl will die really quickly. When the guy finished speaking, looking straight into her eyes, he asked, "If he doesn't stop, won't she have huge problems?" The demoness yanked her hand out of his grasp and turned to go and help the demon prince. He flew towards the prince of demons. She indifferently asked why he wanted to save the prince of demons. After all, they were their enemies. Kneeling down in front of the prince, she checked his wound, accidentally touching a hedgehog sitting next to her with one of her wings. After that, she attached the succubus's cut hair to the demon's wound, which began to heal the wound. And the demoness herself, in favor of what she said earlier, said that, moreover, they had just raided their kingdom. The guy calmly sheathed his sword, seeing no point in keeping it in his hands, and then he confidently said that he had cancer. The guy removed his hair from his forehead and said pathetically that no matter what situation he finds himself in, he does it simply because he is a good person. The hedgehog quickly got up and, shaking himself off the sand, squealed that he was helping too, because he was good. At that moment, the little demon gradually finally came to his senses and rose from the ground on which he had been lying. And then, looking at the engineer with an admiring glance, he exclaimed that, in his opinion, he was simply amazing, in fact. The system immediately beeped with a notification that he had completed the task and reached the highest level of intimacy with the demon prince and the succubus. For this, he was given the symbol of the demon prince's army, which he could transform into any object of his choice. While the guy was reading all these notices, the demon caught his attention and happily said that he really likes him. So his brilliant plan was to make the guy the commander of his corps, but under his control. Looking at all this, the hedgehog grabbed his stomach and began to laugh, thinking that the captain would definitely like it. A new mission window appeared in front of the engineer, in the form of creating a dungeon for the demon prince's army. The demon prince secretly gathered an army to show his prowess as the demon king. He will become the commander of a unit under the direct control of the prince and build a dungeon. Looking at his face, the demon smiled slyly and asked what he thought about his idea. After all, he really likes to command. The guy, in turn, activated the special skill of the raid captain and said that he knew that he needed to be taught a couple of lessons. In response to the fact that the demon girl asked him what he didn't like again, the guy put his hand to the rascal and answered that, first of all, it was his talkativeness. In the next moment, the little demon flew far ahead of the guy, finally got a kick from him. The demoness, looking at this, angrily asked what he was doing there. After all, the prince had never been beaten like that before. And he, in turn, raised his hand and said that he was fine. Not paying attention to the bump on his forehead, the demon said that he knew it, and that it was perfect for him. So much so that even children do not feel sorry. In the next moment, he readily bowed to him and respectfully asked the boy to become his mentor. Listening to what he tells him about the fact that he wants to become just as merciless, the guy stared at him in shock, not knowing whether he was mocking or praising. The demoness looked at this scene in the same way in bewilderment. After all, it was not every day that she heard such words, and especially from him. The demon boy was still bowing down, begging him to become his mentor, because he wants to become the most cruel thief. A clause was added to his task that he should help the prince find his evil heart while the dungeon is being built. The guy quickly pressed the accept button, thinking that he liked it even more. And the hedgehog at this time folded his hands on his chest in displeasure, not understanding what exactly was wrong there. After all, something was wrong there. Unable to comprehend what was happening, the demoness decided that it would be better to repeat after the demoness and bowed down and said that they are both at his service, and now she offers him to rule the world together. Looking in front of him, the monster scratched his head and thoughtfully said that this is training. In turn, standing next to the logs on his shoulders, the slime looked at him and spoke eloquently in his own language that he does not want to hear this useless animal. Not hearing an answer, he lifted the log from his shoulders and asked when they would finally finish. After all, they had been working for a long time. Not noticing the guy approaching him, the monster looked around and asked if they should finish all the work before the captain's arrival. And he, appearing behind him, said that he was right there. Both monsters jumped up with a loud cry, and looking at how he was laughing, quickly moved away from him in different directions. The guy patted the surprised monster on the head, saying that they managed to do a lot in such a short time. And the hedgehog, in his turn, hit him in the stomach with his fist in a friendly way. And then he turned to him and more seriously asked if something out of the ordinary was happening. The monster, as if he had just remembered, said that there was still that same succubus that came there. However, in the next moment, a succubus with a demon around her neck appeared behind him, and the monster screamed loudly and frightened, hearing her asking what about her. Returning to her, he asked her to wait, and then asked how it happened. Slime, in turn, said with a smile that he had been talking about how everything would be fine in the end. Realizing who they were talking about, the boy headed towards the monsters, asking that if they saw both of them, he would make them both his subordinates, and the demon boy shouted loudly and angrily that he was not a subordinate, but a student. The engineer easily answered that he understood everything and let it be as he says. And then, kicking the stone slab, he asked what it was in that case. Duck Slime said something in his own language, and Kwong Kwong, standing behind him, showed the boy that there was actually a well down there. Immediately realizing that this could be a well, the guy excitedly told the slime to quickly move the stone from there. Blinking, he stared in amazement at the man in front of him, bewildered, trying to understand what he was doing there and what the hell it was. Zerdai stretched his sword forward, threateningly shouting that they should wait for him, because it was he who would cut all these treacherous creatures to pieces. Both guys were wearing Golden Bird Knight cloaks that could be used with the stealth skill. It could only be used by Golden Bird Knights, and provided protection if a Golden Bird Knight was nearby. The Knights of the Polar Bear, together with the magician, looked at the hiccuping fat man with disgust, not understanding how it was possible to be like that. The outgoing commander of the guards told Zerdya that this cloak really suits him, and it is immediately obvious. However, since they are leaving the city in secret, he really hopes that the guy can keep it a secret while they are on a mission. Zerdya in turn said that of course he can do it, and at all, if you look at it that way, it's simpler than simple for him. The commander said with a smile that of course, and he trusts him, but due to the confidential nature of this mission, he released only them. Let them not forget it. Although in fact there is no limit on the number of people. In the next moment, he said that of course, if their secret mission is revealed, then the whole mission will fail. The system in turn displayed a notification that they had a new task, and they needed to find a traitor in Arthur's kingdom. And then, after that, it was necessary to send the traitor back to the kingdom. On his command and instructions, the Knights of the Golden Bird had to go to the villages outside the garden to search. And now 3 Knights of the Polar Bear, led by a magician, will search everything and wherever they can on the borders. All they needed to do was to bring him the traitor alive, and he himself would deal with him properly. The magician activated magical portals above their heads, with the help of which they were to be transferred to the places where they were to be searched, and the commander, in turn, wished them all good luck. Meanwhile, the guy continued to look into the well with the hedgehog, saying that he did not think that it was just a well. Slime spoke to the monster that he had already told him about the same thing, and the monster answered that he doubts his words all the time. The engineer tied a rope to his belt and ordered the Steak and Duck Slime to go and finish the tower until he returned. He tells his student and succubus to simply do what he told them. For now, let them not stir under their feet. The succubus sadly looked after him, as if she really did not want him to go to a place that was incomprehensible to himself and to them. However, by the time they could think of something else, the engineer had already jumped into this well, looking into the darkness ahead. After flying down for some time, they stopped and began to hang over this darkness. The rope ended, apparently. The well was really deep. Holding a hedgehog with one hand and holding a sword with the other, the boy said that he had a strange feeling about this place, and perhaps he still wanted to go down to the very end. Telling him to hold on tighter, because they will fall now, the guy cut the rope with his sword in one quick movement. Turning the hedgehog upside down, the boy began to activate the skill of combining the raid captain and Kwong Kwong. It was a flamethrower that absorbed the raid captain's aura and spewed out high-temperature flames. And also, he could easily block melee attacks. But at the moment, the guy was using it to cool down and make his way. In the next moment, the guy flew quickly and jumped onto the concrete floor in front of him with a hedgehog on his back. After that, he got up and with a smile threw a magic stone in the hedgehog's direction, saying that he did a great job, and the guy himself was very pleased. Looking around, his gaze came across a broken passage, standing right in front of him and leading to an unknown destination, looking at which the guy said that as he thought, there is definitely something there, but he doesn't know what. The guy went inside the tunnel into which this entrance led, but suddenly something brown appeared in front of him, from which he immediately jumped back. And then he took out his sword, activating the fiery aura, and looked around, wondering where the monsters could get into the dungeon. Looking in the direction where the hedgehog was pointing, the engineer saw a whole cluster of similar monsters that seemed to be waiting for his meal, and now they were looking at him maliciously, stretching out their disgusting tentacles. One of them decided to try his luck and rush straight at the guy, who easily cut him in half, preventing him from reaching himself. After that, he looked back, decided to check whether he had burned or died at all. Apparently, he still got burned, so the guy happily ran inside and shouted that in that case it would be easier than simple, and he really counted on Kwang Kwang. After some time, the guy finally reached a place that, in his opinion, seemed like a dead end. And indeed, there was a wall ahead, and there was nowhere to move. Meanwhile, the hedgehog stood with his back to him and looked contentedly at the picture of destruction and explosion taking place in the tunnel in front of him. No matter what, he was always ready to fend off the attacks of the monsters that, no matter what, broke through the fire towards the engineer. Having finally gotten rid of all the monsters, the hedgehog put the sphere under his cap and smugly asked the boy what kind of beard he really had, because it simply couldn't be. Saying that there is nothing there, the guy began to walk further around the cave, asking about the monsters and whether they regenerate, because then, this is not a dungeon. When the hedgehog asked how they would get out in such a case, the boy answered that everything was simple. And he took out a rune stone, released a duck slime to them. Appearing in front of them, Slime fearfully asked why, after all, it was him, and couldn't there be someone else? Meanwhile, the reaction team of the Astrum Development Company again received an error notification. One of the developers rested his head on folded hands, seemingly not noticing the guy who approached him from the side. The second developer who approached also did not pay much attention to him, busy with his thoughts about the raid captain. The captain of the raid began to exercise every day at a certain time, and now there were no more problems with the transfer of nutrients. Approaching the developer, he put his hand on his trembling shoulder and asked what happened this time and what caused the error. He turned around and, looking him in the eye, answered that it was absurd, and what happened was that in the game, the captain of the raid disappeared.